The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives.
Story 1. Cornered by my wife.
My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea, and that's fine. But that's what was so strange about this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I'd have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning and knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes, and a strand of her long dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her. I did burn the shit out of my lips. "Geez, Lynn," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared the shit out of me." She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for her, like I said. But I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted that I loved her, and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m. and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of vodka in hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed. I'll admit it. Not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood there frozen in shock, wondering what fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to be sure she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed. But she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. "You were peeking at me again, from over there," I said. pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, she burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. "You creep me the fuck out sometimes. You know that," I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even," she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once she even managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all, had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so that only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth was she doing this. She didn't answer, but she had slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumpy whenever I was home and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m. I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a fucking heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was fucking terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you, but joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. "What the fuck, Lynn?" I snapped. "This shit is getting really fucking annoying." I waited for her to apologize, or to call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan, so quiet I wondered if I heard it at all. And then complete silence. "Lynn?" I called out, not able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response, just my own heavy breathing. I swear to God. Just fucking stop it, I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I would expect from me talking to her like that. I never screamed at her before, but there was nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared, too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like a fucking lifetime when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom. So I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs. But no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, and mentally prepared myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers, and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan, louder than before, but this time I was able to tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife, who was peeking out at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for even that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight. As if she could barely contain her excitement, a short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold, maybe a little of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I had a fight, but didn't get into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I'd wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I'd had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She'd never left the fucking bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill, so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up just as the sun started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that when that familiar feeling came over me, I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me she'd been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger trumped any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home," I shouted. "Now." She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife, Rebecca, hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt. Just a slight indent. Animal, probably. Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out of work that day and turned my cell off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her, that no matter what promises she made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I figured I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she'd sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." And more of the same, all texts telling me she loved me, and she wanted me home. How worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled, like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after her bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from this situation, but if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully, I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place. But is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She'd made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know. She's like a different person, I said, choosing. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I had been dealing with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed and loved my wife, but how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about that, I said. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work. She said, cleaning from the table. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator No. She just asked if you were awake yet, and I said that you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no, just said to let you sleep. she said as she washed the dishes. That's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. No. She looked awful, though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I swore an oath to love and honor her through sickness and in health? Clearly she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believed she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police. And besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she'd been. She still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would have probably said that I was overreacting, but this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong, dangerous even. Like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband, I was well within my rights to have her committed. But what if she simply acted normal in their presence? She'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others. They'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed. So I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to. Yes, she answered, already sounding irritated. Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk? I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She said, coolly. It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something. I was quickly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin. What is that you want from me? She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior, or possibly any mental health issues, I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind, she said. But I cut her off before she could get rid of me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother you would be as well. I said, my frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn. I tried. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. Marianne, what's what? I started. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She'd said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no. I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that. As if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet. But I told them about our last encounter, how she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for YouTube, Rebecca offered, if only half-heartedly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a fucking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What do you guys use to clean the floors around here?" "Shit," Chris mumbled. "Shut up," I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark, despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name. "Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked eventually. "Aren't we looking for your wife?" He was looking at me like I was a moron. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head, but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church. After saying our vows, she looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals, and I wondered how she'd gotten them, and shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But fuck me, your wife's in here collecting eyeballs. Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go, he called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous. All right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue and I couldn't help but gag. Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help. Ben, she needs a fucking exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any... His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered, as I saw what we... Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making, a sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes, and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements, as if she were nodding. Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding, I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand. But before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. Are you bleeding? Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. Chris, run! Go! I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. Jesus, Lynn, Chris said. You were playing hide and seek? I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. Move your ass, Chris, I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions, and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her, and then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over, and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me. Still on the line with 911, I watched the rearview mirror. Sure, I'd see her there, running after us, but I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so, because 40 minutes ago I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you," and a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched.
Story 2. Masked Wife.
Samantha told me about it on our 3rd date. We were watching a movie on her couch when I made my move to kiss her. She whipped her hand in front of my face and blocked me. "There's something you need to know," she said. I braced myself. "Here it comes. I'm not ready for a relationship. Nothing to do with you, of course." It was the absolute last thing that I wanted to hear, because I was already crazy about her. "Okay," I said. "I have a removable face." "That's a new one." "You have a what now?" I was about to laugh, but she was wearing a deadly serious expression. "I have a removable face. Is that like a metaphor or something?" "No, my face is literally removable. Look closely." She lifted her chin and traced her jawline with a finger. "You can see the seam." After admiring how beautiful her neck was for a dizzying moment, I leaned in for an inspection. It was very hard to see, but it did look like there was a slightly unnatural transition there from her face to her throat. I grew dizzier as a dozen questions rushed into my brain. "Don't bother asking why or how or anything like that," said Samantha. "I can't tell you that. If that's going to be a problem, you should leave now. I'm letting you know this because I like you, and I want to take the next step. But this is non-negotiable." "Okay," I said, unsure of what was happening. "Not a problem. So what? You have a removable face. Who cares? It looks good." "There's something else. Once a day, usually in the evening, I have to remove the face and disinfect the inside of it. If I don't, it will rot. This takes about an hour, give or take, depending on how my day went. During this time, you must never ever look at my real face. Never. Do you understand?" Yes, got it. Don't ask about it. Don't look at your real face." Samantha stood up. "Now, I'm going to go into the bathroom and clean my face. That will give you plenty of time to think about what I've told you. If you're here when I'm done, that's great. I would like that. But if you're gone, I'll understand." She turned and walked into her bedroom. I sat in stunned silence as I heard the bathroom door close. I gave the thing some serious thought. It was possible that it was a joke of some kind. It was possible that it was a delusion. Was it possible that it was true? Well, it was certainly possible to transform an actor's face with movie makeup. So I supposed it was possible that Samantha wore a removable face every day. Maybe she had had a horrible accident where her flesh had been mangled. Maybe her face had been melted by acid, or burned by fire, or the skin shorn off by heavy machinery. If it had, I would never know, because she would never tell me, and I would never see it. I pictured a face of raw, naked muscle, rotting away. Could I kiss her, if that was what I was kissing? But wasn't that what we all were, under the skin? Just muscle and bone and blood and squishy organs. I paced around the living room, running my hand through my hair. I liked Samantha a lot. She was smart and funny and beautiful. But was that beauty real? Did it count? Did it matter if it was real or not? Was I being superficial even worrying about it? When she came out of the bathroom, I was still there. I looked at her face. She smiled and I was in love. We dated. We moved in together. We decided to get married. For the most part, it was a completely normal relationship, typical of two young people in love, building a life together. During the day, it was easy to forget about the face altogether. It looked natural enough, and only in certain positions, in certain lights, was there ever any indication that it wasn't natural. But every night was the same. Samantha would close herself in the bathroom, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2, and clean the inside of her face. The curiosity never left me. I would sit there and wonder what was under that face. I came so close to barging in on her a few times, but I never did. I did occasionally ask her about it, about what, if anything, had happened, about how it was possible to make the removable face look so real, about what it really looked like underneath. I tried to coax her into showing me, assuring her that I loved her no matter what, and didn't give a damn what her real face looked like. I was just curious, that's all. She never showed me or told me the story behind it. She didn't get upset at me unless I was really badgering her. She'd just shrug and say, "You know you can't see it. You know I can't tell you about it." I never told anybody about Samantha's removable face. It's not that she asked me not to. I just didn't think it was anybody's business. Except once, I did tell somebody. It was during my bachelor's party. We had rented several cabins in Big Sur and spent the night drinking and packing our noses with powders that we shouldn't have been packing our noses with. Everyone else had passed out, and the sun was creeping up behind us as I stood on the majestic cliffs with my friend Chris, looking down on the Pacific waves crashing against the rocks. Chris was my best friend, as close to a brother as I'd known. We'd grown up together and visited each other at college often and spent the summers together. After college, we'd moved to different cities, but we stayed in close contact. Standing there on the cliffs, I told Chris about Samantha's removable face. At first, he thought I was joking. Then he had 1,000 questions, most of which I couldn't answer. What's underneath? I don't know, man. I don't know. Doesn't that drive you crazy, not knowing? I shrugged. Lots of stuff I don't know. Don't know how to do calculus. And I don't know what happens when we die. But dude, she's about to be your wife, and you don't even know what she looks like. I mean, I'd have to take a look. Like, you could set a camera up in the bathroom. That's where she does it, right? Set up a camera and have a look, and then you'll know. I sighed. Yeah, it drives me crazy. I've asked her 1,000,000 times, but she told me I could never look. Gotta respect that. Man, even if I don't like it, that's love. Chris laughed. You telling me to respect a woman? Up is down now. Then we fell back into talking about old times as a new day dawned. Chris was in town for business last week and planned on spending the weekend at our house. The conversation at Big Sur had happened 4 years ago, and we hadn't spoken about Samantha's removable face since. Despite keeping in close contact and seeing each other as often as two people transforming into adults in different parts of the country can, It happened on Saturday evening. We were lounging lazily in the backyard, deep into the beer, having just finished with some grilled steaks, when I got a text from work. God damn it. I groaned. I have to make a work call. Seriously? Said Samantha, raising an artificial eyebrow, on a Saturday night. My biggest client, baby, sorry. It is what it is, I guess, said my wife. I'm going to head inside and get cleaned up. Chris, are you okay just hanging out for a bit? Chris smiled. I'll be fine. Got my beer. Got some weeds to pull in your garden. God knows your lazy-ass husband isn't going to do it. Those tomatoes are choking to death. It's a tragedy. I rolled my eyes and went into the side yard to make my call. 15 minutes into it, I heard the screams coming from inside. Both my best friend and my wife were wailing in terror. I dropped the phone and ran into the house and down the hall to our bedroom, through the open door. I could see that the door to the master bathroom was also standing open. Don't come in, screamed Samantha. I don't have my face on. Call an ambulance. He looked. Oh God, he looked. She sounded desperate and truly horrified. That made me desperate and horrified. And I wanted to rush into the bathroom, but I knew suddenly that that would be a mistake. I knew suddenly that Samantha didn't want me to look at her real face, not out of a sense of vanity, but for my own safety. Chris staggered backwards, out of the bathroom. He was holding a straightened-out paperclip, which he had used to pick the privacy lock. Now he was stabbing it again and again into his eyes, shouting gibberish. He was clearly in the depths of madness, and it turned my stomach to see him mutilate himself. Call a fucking ambulance, my wife screamed. Don't come in here! He fucking looked. I turned and ran back to the side yard, where my phone was lying in the newly mowed grass. My client was still on the line, alarmed, asking what was happening, what all the screaming was. I hung up on him and called 911. When the paramedics arrived, Chris was having a seizure in the hallway. Samantha was stroking his head, sobbing. Her face was on, but it had been done hastily, and everything looked a little off. My world has been dark this past week. My best friend is in a psychiatric hospital under suicide watch. He's completely blind and mostly catatonic, except when he slips into a violent, babbling mania. The doctors are optimistic that his state is temporary, but they don't know the truth about what caused it, because I told the paramedics that Chris had taken a large dose of psychedelic mushrooms and fallen into psychosis. I saw no good reason to tell the truth about what had happened. Who would believe that one look at my wife's real face would make somebody insane? At best, we would be the subjects of a long investigation. At worst, we would have to prove that what we were saying was true by showing somebody Samantha's face. Then the same thing would happen again. And what after that? I had no idea, and no interest in finding out. For Samantha's part, I knew that she would never consent to show anybody her real face, no matter what the consequences of refusal were. I did get a follow-up call from the police, asking me to confirm my story. The hospital found no traces of psilocybin in Chris's blood, though that's not unheard of, since it has a short half-life. If they end up testing his hair, I will likely be in a lot of trouble, but that's truly the least of my concerns. Samantha is in a state of her own. She still cleans the inside of her face, though not as regularly, and when she puts it back on, it's always crooked now. It is beginning to smell a little bit. I've tried to assure her that it wasn't her fault. He knew. I told him that nobody was ever allowed to look at it. He knew, and then he broke into the bathroom. This is not on you. Baby, please, talk to me. Not on me. That one look at my fucking face makes people insane. Please, I just need some time alone. As for me, I'm doing my best to hold it together. Do you know what's strange? Though, despite what happened to Chris, I still find myself curious about what my wife's real face looks like. More curious than ever, really.
Story 3. Whistling midnight.
Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our street whistling softly. You can only hear it if you're in the living room or the kitchen when they walk by, and it always starts at exactly 3:03. The sound starts faint, somewhere near the beginning of the lane near the Carson place. We're towards the middle of the street, so the whistling moves past us before fading away in the direction of the cul-de-sac. When I was younger, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen some nights to listen. Mom and Dad didn't like that, and we'd catch hell if they found us out there. But they were never too hard on us since we always stuck to the one big rule. Don't try to look at whatever was whistling. My neighborhood is a funny place. I've lived here since I was 6 and I love it. The houses are small but well kept. Good-sized yards, plenty of places to roam. There are a lot of other kids here my age. I turned 13 back in October. We grew up together and would always play foursquare in the cul-de-sac or roam around from back porch to back porch in the summer. This was a good place to grow up. I'm old enough to see it. And there's only the two strange things here: the night whistling and the good luck. The whistling never bothered me much. Like I said, I couldn't even hear it from my bedroom, but Mom and Dad don't like talking about it, so I've stopped asking questions. My dad is a strong guy, tall and calm. He has an accent since he moved to the US as a kid. His family, my grandparents, they're from the islands. That's what they call it. My dad. The only time he isn't so calm is if the whistler comes up. He talks a little quicker then, eyes move faster, and he tells us not to think about it so much and to always remember the one rule. The big rule: don't try to look outside when the whistler goes past. Not that we could look even if we wanted. See, there are shutters on the inside of every window, thick pieces of heavy canvas that pull down from the top and latch to the bottom of the window frame. Each latch even has a small lock, about the size of what you'd find on a diary. My dad locks those shutters every night before we all go to bed and keeps the key in his room. My mom, I don't know what she thinks about the whistling. I've seen her out in the living room before at 3:03 when the sound starts. I could see her if I cracked my door open just an inch to peek. She's not out there often, at least I haven't caught her much. But once or twice a month I think she sits out there on our big red couch just listening. The whistler has the same tune every night. It's cheerful. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Remember how I said there are two odd things about where I live? Well, besides our night whistler, everyone in my neighborhood is really lucky. It's hard to explain, and Dad doesn't like us talking about this part much either. But good things just seem to happen to people around here a lot. Usually, it's small things: winning a radio contest, or getting an unexpected promotion at work, or finding some arrowheads buried in the yard. You know, the authentic kind. The weather is pretty good, and there's no crime, and everybody's gardens bloom extra bright in the fall. A million little blessings. I've heard my mom say about living here, but the main reason we stay here, why we moved here in the first place, is my sister Nola. She was born very sick. Something with her lungs. We couldn't even bring her home when she was born, only visit her in the hospital. She was so small. I remember, small even compared to the other babies. A machine had to breathe for her. We moved into our house here to be closer to the hospital. As soon as we moved here, Nola started getting better. The doctors couldn't figure it out. They chalked it up to whatever they were doing, but we all could tell they were confused. But my parents knew, even I knew, Nola getting better was just another of the million little blessings we got for living in our neighborhood. So that's why we stayed even after we found out that for every small miracle that happens here every day, now and then some bad things happen, but they only happen if you look for the whistler. See, our neighborhood has a welcoming committee. They show up with macaroni casserole and a gift basket and a manila folder whenever someone new moves in. They're very friendly. 4 people showed up when we moved in 7 years ago. The committee made small talk, gave me a Snickers bar, and took turns holding Nola. It was her first week out of the hospital, so they were extra careful. Then the committee asked to speak to my parents in private, so I was sent to my room where I still managed to hear nearly every word. The welcoming committee told my parents about how nice the neighborhood was, really exceptionally, hard to explain kind of nice. And then they told my parents about the even harder to explain whistling that happened every morning at 3:03 and ended at the tick of 3:05. The group, our new neighbors, warned my parents that the whistling was quiet, would never harm or hurt us, as long as we didn't look for what was making the sound. This part they stressed, and I pushed my ear into the door, straining to hear them. People who went looking for the whistler had their luck change. Sometimes tragically, a black cloud would hang over anyone that looked. Anything that could go wrong would. The manila envelope the committee brought over contained newspaper clippings, stories about car crashes and ruined lives, public deaths and freak accidents. Not everyone dies, I heard the head of the committee tell my dad. But the life goes out of them. Even if they live, there's no light in them ever again, no presence. My mom, I could tell she wasn't taking it seriously. She kept asking if this was some prank they play on new neighbors. At one point my mom got angry, accused the committee of trying to scare us out of our new home, asked them if they were racist on account of my dad being from the islands. My dad calmed her down, told her he could tell our new neighbors were sincere and they were just trying to help us. He explained that he grew up hearing these kinds of stories from his mom and that he knew there were strange things that walked among us. Some of those strange things were good and some were bad, but most were just different. After the committee left, Dad went out to the hardware store, bought the canvas blinds, the latches, and the locks, and installed them on every window in the house after dinner. That first night in our new house, I crept out of my room at 3 a.m., only to find my dad awake, sitting on the living room couch, holding my baby sister. My dad held up his finger in a shh motion, but patted the couch next to him. I sat and we waited. At exactly 3:03, we heard the whistling. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. It came and it went, just like our neighbors said. The whistling returns each night, and we never look, and we enjoy our million little blessings every day. Nola breathes on her own, and she's grown into a strong, clever girl. My dad even joined the welcoming committee. We don't get new neighbors often. Why would anyone want to leave? But when a new family moves in, my dad and the committee bring them macaroni casserole, a gift basket, and the manila folder. I can always tell by the look on my dad's face when he comes back if the family took the committee seriously, or if we'd be getting new neighbors again very soon. Not long ago, a family moved in directly next to us. The previous owner, Ms. Maddie, passed away at age 105. She'd lived a good, long life. Our new neighbors seemed like they'd fit in just fine. They believed the welcoming committee, took my dad's advice about the locking shutters since they had a young child of their own. Whatever newspaper clippings were in that manila envelope, whatever evidence, my dad never let us see. But I imagine it must have been awfully convincing since our neighbors got along with no issues for the first month. One night, when our new neighbors had to leave town, they sent their son, Holden, to stay with us. He was 12, a year under me in school. I didn't know him well before that night, but as soon as his parents dropped him off after dinner, I could tell it was going to be a bad time. "Do you know who is always out there whistling every night?" Holden asked the moment the adults left the room. The three of us were sitting in the den, some Disney movie playing idly on the television. My sister and I exchanged a glance. "We don't talk about that." I said, "I think it's that weirdo that lives in the big yellow house on the corner." Holden said, "Mr. Tollis?" my sister asked. "No way. He's really nice." Holden shrugged. "Must be a psycho killer." Then, Nola tensed. "We don't talk about it," I repeated. "Let's go in my room and play Nintendo." We spent the next few hours playing games, eating popcorn and then watching movies. A typical sleepover, but I could see Holden was getting antsy. After my parents had wished us a good night, locked the blinds, and gone to bed, Holden stood up from his beanbag and walked over to where Nola and I were sitting on my bed. "Have you ever even tried looking?" he asked. "It's nearly time." Like most sleepovers, we'd conveniently ignored any suggestion of a bedtime. I was shocked to see he was right. It was almost 3 a.m. I sighed. "We don't... See, I can't even try to look because my dad locks the blinds every night and hides the key," he continued, ignoring me. "So does our dad," said Nola. "No," replied Holden. "No, he doesn't. You saw him do it," I said, a little sharper than I meant to sound. Holden grinned. Your dad locks the blinds. Yeah, but he doesn't hide the key. He keeps it right on his normal keychain. So, I asked, worried I already knew what he would say next. Because I had noticed that my dad didn't bother hiding the key anymore after all of these years. Because he knew we took it seriously. So, after your dad locked up, but before your parents went to bed, I went to the bathroom, and on my way, I may have peeked into their room, and I may have seen your dad's keychain on his nightstand, and I maybe went and borrowed the key to blinds. Nola and I stared, and his grin only grew wider. You're lying, I said. Holden shrugged. You can check if you want. Just open your parents' door and look. You'll see his keychain right there on the nightstand. Stay here, I told both of them. Don't move a muscle. I hurried over to my parents' room, but hesitated at the door. If Holden wasn't lying, my dad would be angry. Beyond angry, I was scared thinking about it, but more scared of an open window with the whistler right outside. I opened the door, barely an inch, and looked in, but it was too dark to see. Taking a deep breath, I walked into the room. 2 steps into the dark, I froze. The whistling started, and I could hear it clearly from my parents' room. I never realized, but they must have heard the sound every night since we moved into the house. They never told us. I don't think I could have slept through it. I stood there, listening to the whistling come closer, unsure whether I should turn on a light or call out for my dad. Soft sounds from the living room brought me back to reality. Nola, I yelled, running out of my parents' room. Holden and Nola were standing near the front door next to a window. Holden wasn't lying. I could see him fumbling with the lock on one of the blinds. I heard a click. He did have the key. Holden let out a quick laugh. Nola stood next to him, hunched up, afraid but maybe curious. The whistling was right outside our house now. I think I made a sound, called out. I can't remember. Time felt frozen, clock hands nailed to the face. But I found myself moving. I'm not fast. I've never been athletic. Somehow, though, I covered the space between myself and Nola in a moment. My eyes were locked on her, but I heard Holden pull the blind all the way down so it could release. I heard the snap of it start to raise, and I heard the whistling just on the other side of the window. But I had my arms around Nola, and I turned us so she was facing away from the window. At the same time, I jammed my eyes shut. The blind whipped open. The whistling stopped. I felt Nola shaking in my arms. Don't look, okay? I told her. Don't turn around. We were positioned so that she was facing back towards the hallway, and I was facing the window. My eyes were still closed. I felt her nod into my shoulder. I reached out with the arm not holding Nola and tried to touch Holden. My hand brushed against his arm. He was shaking worse than Nola. Holden? I asked. Silence. I reached past him and gingerly felt for the window. Eyes still sealed shut. The glass was cold against my fingertips, colder than it should have been for the time of year. I moved my hand up the window, searching for the string to the blind. The glass began to get warmer the further I reached, and there was a gentle hum feeding back into my fingertips. I tried not to think about what might be on the other side of the window. Finally, I touched the string and yanked the blinds shut. I opened my eyes. In the dim light leaking out from the kitchen, I could make out Holden, pale and small, staring at the now closed window. Holden? I asked again. He turned towards me and he screamed. Everything became a flurry of motion. Lights sparked to life in the hall, then the living room. My parents' footsteps thudded across the hardwood floor. I didn't turn to look back at them. My eyes were glued to Holden. He was pale, had bit his lip so hard there was a thin red line of blood running down his chin, and he'd wet himself. What happened? My dad asked from behind me. I managed to swivel away from Holden and look back. He looked. I'd never seen my dad scared before, but I saw it that night. In that moment, an old, ugly terror stitched on his face, a parent's fear. Just Holden? He mouthed to me. I nodded yes. My dad let out a breath. He looked so relieved I nearly expected him to cheer. But then he turned to Holden and my dad's face changed. I wondered if he felt bad for feeling good that Holden was the only one that looked. There was a knock at the door. We all froze. Holden whimpered. "Don't answer it," my mom said. She stood at the threshold of the hall. I'd always thought she was a skeptic and just humored my dad about the windows and the whistler, but that night, we were all believers. I noticed that both of my parents held baseball bats they must have taken from their bedroom. The knock came again, a little louder this time. "Please don't open the door," Holden whispered. My dad walked over to him, hugged him close. "We won't," my dad promised, still holding his bat. "Nothing is coming in here tonight." Thud, thud, thud. This time the knocking was loud enough to rattle the door. Holden screamed again, and Nola clutched her arms around my neck. My mom came over and knelt down next to us, wrapping my sister and me close. "Thud, thud, thud. Call the police," my mom whispered to my dad. The knocking instantly stopped. My dad looked over his shoulder at us. "Do you think—" He was cut off by frantic knocking that trailed off to a polite tap, tap, tap. "Police," something said from the other side of the door. The voice from outside sounded exactly like my mom, like a parrot repeating the words back to her. "Police. Call the police. Tap, 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 police." My mom pulled us closer. "Police. Police. 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 Please stop," I heard her whisper. "I don't think calling them will help," my dad said. "How will we know when they're the ones at the door?" The knocking came back harder than before. The door shook. Then it stopped. After a long moment, I heard the knocking again, but it was coming from our back door. We all turned together towards the back door, but the knocking immediately returned to the front door. Front to back to front, loud, then quiet, then loud again. Suddenly, the sound was coming from both doors at once. Big, heavy blows like a sledgehammer. Then something started rapping against all of the windows in the house. Then the walls. It was like we were living inside a drum with a dozen people trying to play at once. Or we were a turtle and something was attempting to claw us out of our shell. "Stop," Holden yelled. The knocking died. "I won't tell," Holden said, staring at the door. "I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw. Just please go away." We waited for nearly a minute. Then we heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap coming from the window Holden had looked through earlier. Holden started to cry, sobbing like a prisoner watching gallows being built outside their cell. My dad held him, brushed his hair, but never lied to him, never told him things would be okay. The tapping at the window went on for the rest of the night. We huddled together in the living room for I don't know how long. Eventually, my mom tried to take us kids into my room while my dad stayed to watch the door. But the second we moved into my bedroom, the knocking came back. So loud it was possible to ignore. I was afraid the door couldn't take it. We went back to the living room and the knocking stopped. Only the tap, tap, tap on the window remained. None of us slept that night. The tapping stopped around 7 a.m. That's about the time the sun comes up here. We waited another 2 hours before my dad opened the blinds from one window. He made us all go back to my parents' bedroom first. I heard him open the door, then come back in. "Okay," he told us, "it's done." Holden's parents came back around lunchtime. My mum and dad walked Holden over to his house and they all went inside for quite a while. Nola and I watched from the window. She stuck to me the whole day, right at my side, sometimes holding my hand. When my parents came back, they looked grim, but wouldn't tell us what they said to Holden's family. It was a Sunday, so we all spent the day together, ordered pizza and watched movies. That night, everyone slept in my room. Nola and my mom in the bed with me. My dad in a chair he'd pulled over. There was no knocking that night or any night since. We didn't see much of Holden or his parents for the rest of that week, but by Thursday there was a moving truck in their driveway. Nola and I watched them packing up the whole afternoon after school. What sticks with me most is how tired Holden and his parents looked. All three had the same pallor, grim mouths and lightless eyes. Even from across the street I could tell something was very wrong. Holden and his family were gone before sunset. I remember what the original welcoming committee said to my parents when we moved in. Not everyone who looks at the Whistler dies. A million little tragedies. I think Holden's parents must have looked either to comfort him if they didn't believe or share the burden if they did. I watch Nola some days, happy and young and alive, and I wonder if I'd been slower. If she'd looked out the window that night, would I have looked too? To comfort her, to share that burden. I'm glad I don't have to find out. We still live in that house, in that neighborhood. We still hear our Whistler walking past every night. The blessings, the luck, the good things here are too good to leave. But we're careful. We don't have friends over to spend the night anymore. And my dad hides the key to the blinds very, very well. Not that I've gone looking. Some things you just don't need to look for. Story 4. Cross-country journey. My wife, Mia, and I were driving cross-country. It was our first attempt at the Great American Road Trip. Mia and I rented a small RV, more of a camper than a full-blown RV. We packed up a couple suitcases with plenty of room for any souvenirs, and we hit the dusty trail. We started our journey on the Mother Road, Route 66, driving south from Chicago until we connected to I-70 and shot straight west through Missouri. The goal was to see those parts of the country we had never seen before, stopping anywhere that seemed interesting, from the plains of Kansas up through the Badlands of Wyoming and South Dakota. In Missouri, we saw the world's largest cap gun. In Kansas, we visited the Evel Knievel Museum and the world's largest belt buckle. We love all those kitschy, tourist trap places. Eventually, we made it to Colorado, and after a few hours more of driving through amber waves of grain, we saw them, the Rocky Mountains. We made an exit and headed north through the winding mountain highways. The Rockies were gorgeous, snow-capped in the middle of summer. Some of the peaks pierced through the white, fluffy clouds. We saw a sign that read, "Traffic tunnel, 3 miles." A little further, and sure enough, there it was, a large tunnel bored directly through the mountain in front of us. A large sign read, "Pike Tunnel, longest traffic tunnel in the nation. Please turn your headlights on now." "How long is it?" asked Mia. "That's what she said," I quipped. But she was right. There was no information beyond the detail that this was the longest tunnel in the nation. "Can't be more than a mile or 2, I said as I watched the little white car ahead of us slip into the darkness. A moment later, we joined it. The tunnel was lit by fluorescence that gave everything a greenish-yellow tinge. On the left-hand side was a raised walkway behind a railing for maintenance access. Initially, I was struck by the incredible amount of work that went into the construction of this man-made marvel. "We're under 1 million tons of Rocky Mountain right now," I said. "How many years before this caves in?" Mia responded. I shot her a look. "Let's save the cave-in talk until we're out on the other side. I'm just saying, nature will take this back eventually," she continued. I scanned the empty road ahead of us. "Where did the other car go?" I asked. We were now alone in the tunnel, no cars ahead of us nor behind us. "Huh, they must have sped off ahead. Maybe they're scared of a cave-in." My Spotify playlist had stopped playing. Mia looked at the phone. No cell service. She turned on the radio and spun the dial only to find static. "You're not going to be able to pick up a station in here," I said. She turned the volume down. "Just wanted to check. If only we had some CDs. This tunnel really keeps going." "I would have thought we'd be through it by now," I replied. I looked at the RV's odometer, 45,600 miles. I picked up speed. I wanted to try and catch up to the little white car. Up until this point, the tunnel was a straight shot, but now the tunnel started to curve to the right. It may have been my imagination, but it also felt as though we were descending. Mia felt it too, and she started to get antsy. "Where did that other car go? How long is this tunnel?" There was an urgency in her voice. I was getting nervous. Claustrophobia was not usually a problem for me, But when I looked down at the odometer and I saw that it had gone up by 3 miles, my mind began to wander to unsettling places. We were descending in altitude. I could feel it. I could see a slope in the lights on the ceiling and the railing of the maintenance walkway. I could feel a pressure in my head, and I was getting cold. "Could you grab me a Coke from the back, Mia?" I couldn't have Mia getting anxious. That would only start a chain reaction and make me freak out, which would then make her freak out. She unbuckled and ducked into the back of the RV to where we had a cooler stocked with drinks and food. Just as she stepped into the back, I saw something. There, standing on the side of the road, was a man wearing a reflective safety vest and a hard hat. He was waving to me as I passed him by. Something about him looked strange. I watched him in the side view mirror as we passed, and he was still watching the RV, still waving at the back of our vehicle as he faded into the distance. Mia reappeared from the back of the RV, Coke in hand. She popped it and handed it to me. "You look worried." "I'm fine." I smiled and took a sip of the Coke. "Eric, slow down." I slammed on the brakes as I saw what made Mia scream. In the road in front of us was a roadblock. 2 reflective traffic sawhorses blocked both lanes of the tunnel. Beyond the roadblock, the lights of the tunnel were dark. There was nothing but a void of blackness. Standing in front of the roadblock was another man wearing a reflective vest and a hard hat. Only this time his hard hat had a light on top which obscured his face. We came to a jolting stop. I turned to Mia. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm fine," she replied. "It's a cave-in, isn't it?" "God, I hope not." I rolled down the window, leaned out and yelled to the man in the hard hat. "Hey, what's going on?" The man was about 5 yards away. He took 2 steps towards us and then raised a hand to his mouth and yelled, "Just doing some maintenance." "How long is it going to take?" I yelled back. The man made a hand gesture as if he didn't hear me. "How long is it going to take?" I called again. He made the same gesture. I unbuckled my seatbelt and grabbed the door release. "What are you doing?" Mia asked. "I gotta know what's going on." "Eric, just stay here. It might not be safe." "I'll be just a second," I said. I pushed the door open and stepped down from the RV. "Stay in your vehicle," the man yelled. He took a couple steps towards me with his hand out, telling me to stop. "What's the hold-up?" I shouted. The man was a bit closer now, but I still couldn't see his face through the shining light on his helmet. "Please stay in your vehicle," he shouted. There was something off about him. Then I heard it. A scream, or something, rolled from deep in the tunnel. The worker turned and looked into the darkness. Then he ran past the barricades, and soon all we could see of him was the light on his helmet. The light disappeared a moment later. "What the hell was that?" "Is someone hurt?" Mia asked. "I have no idea," I said. "Should we do something?" Mia asked. I just sat there and watched the pitch-black tunnel in front of me. I had no idea what to tell her. I checked the side view mirrors. There was still nobody behind us. "Where are the other cars?" I asked. "They must have gotten through before the roadblock, or maybe they caused the roadblock," Mia replied. I saw another worker a little ways back. We could try to go back and talk to him. We'd be going straight into any oncoming cars. There's a maintenance walkway. We didn't pass him that long ago. We can probably catch him on foot. Maybe we should just wait for the guy to come back. She reached over and grabbed my arm. I squeezed her hand. She was right. I looked out at the tunnel ahead of us. I turned on the RV's high beams, but all I could see beyond the roadblock was more tunnel and more road. I checked my phone. Unsurprisingly, there was no service still. We waited, but the man never came back. "It's been 20 minutes, Mia said. "How come there hasn't been another car behind us?" I was having the same thought. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out. I looked back at the road behind us. It went back about 200 yards before curving out of sight. There was no sign of that first worker I saw on the maintenance walkway. I looked at the roadblock ahead of us and clicked on the RV's high beams. There was nothing beyond the roadblock but more tunnel. It didn't look like it was under construction, just very dark. I think we should keep going. I said, "What about the roadblock?" "We'll move those sawhorses out of the way and just drive past," I said as I opened my door. Mia looked at me, then she cast her eyes to the dark tunnel ahead of us. I knew she was processing the same limited options that I was. Driving backwards would be a huge risk in the instance of another car finally coming along. Getting out and walking would take God knows how long. We could have driven 10 miles at this point. Forward was our best option. "Let's do it," Mia said. We jumped out and quickly pulled the two sawhorses out of the right lane. I pulled the RV up past the barriers. Then we jumped out again and put the sawhorses back where they were. We didn't need another car to come barreling through. We were finally moving again, slowly. It was pitch black, save for the high beams of the RV. We crept forward at around 15 miles per hour. As the tunnel turned and twisted, my eyes started to play tricks on me. I kept seeing shapes at the furthest point of the tunnel. I kept seeing something standing just at the end of the next bend, but as we rolled forward, there was nothing there. "Where are the workers?" Mia asked. "I don't know." I was done rationalizing. This was all wrong. Traffic tunnels are never this long. My mind started to wander to all the road trip urban legends I'd read about. The killer in the back seat, the disappearing gas station, the pale man in the cornfield. Did we stumble into some strange outlier location, an in-between point on the endless roads that cross this country? Then I saw it. "Look, a person, thank God," Mia shouted. As we rounded a curve in the tunnel, a group of maintenance workers entered our view. The three of them stood on the left side of the road behind two more sawhorses topped with flashing lights. Two of them faced towards us. The third was facing the other two. The one with his back to us wore a light on his hard hat. Was this the same guy we saw earlier? How did he get this far away? I approached slowly and rolled down the window. "Hey, you left us waiting back there," I yelled. There was no response. In fact, all three men were completely silent, and it was hard to tell in the flashing light of the sawhorses, but they looked to be standing completely still. "Hello," I yelled again. I pushed open my door and stepped out onto the pavement. "Eric, wait." I held up a finger to Mia. "Just a second." I slowly stepped towards the three men. "Hello?" No response. What the fuck? The bright lights of the sawhorses obscured their faces. I kept moving closer. "Hey, what's going on?" Then I saw it. Their faces. They were plastic. In front of me stood three mannequins. I backed away toward the RV. Then I turned and walked hurriedly to the vehicle. I was seriously freaked out, but I didn't want to alarm Mia. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. "They're mannequins," I said. "What?" "They're mannequins." "Why? What?" "I don't know." I looked back over at the three figures and my blood ran cold. The hard hat mannequin had somehow turned around to face us. All three figures appeared to be watching us now. Then we heard it. A loud, resonant banging on the side, and then the roof of the RV. "What the hell was that?" Mia whispered. We listened, holding our breath. Then, a shuffling sound. Something was moving on or in the RV. "Stay here," I said. I got up. "Eric, wait!" I moved to the back of the RV. It was dark. I went for a drawer in the kitchenette space and pulled out a flashlight. I moved to the rear of the RV, the bedroom. My flashlight illuminated an empty room. "Whoever is back here, I have a gun." A shitty bluff, but I didn't see anything. I shone the light out of the windows of each side of the RV. Nothing. Then I heard it, a shuffling sound, from right above me. I looked up and screamed, "Fuck!" On the roof of the RV, staring through the skylight, was a woman with vacuous black eyes and a dead smile. Her stringy black hair dangled down towards me, casting thin black shadows across her horrible pale face. "Mia, drive! Fast!" I screamed. Mia jumped over to the driver's seat, shifted into gear and stomped on the gas. The RV was clunky, but it could move when it needed to. We lurched forward and I fell back. I trained my flashlight up onto the skylight again and the woman was gone. I scrambled to my feet and looked out of the side windows. Did Mia shake her off? There was no sign of the woman. I moved to the passenger seat, breathing heavily and sweating. "What happened?" she asked, keeping the RV at a steady 50 mph. "There was a woman on the roof," I said flatly. I realized now that I was in a kind of shock. "A woman?" Her eyes were black. Mia just looked at me, then back at the tunnel ahead of us. "There's something wrong with this tunnel," I whispered. Mia pointed at the road ahead. "Look." I looked out at the tunnel. There were more mannequins, a lot more mannequins. They were positioned on both sides of the road. They were all facing us, and even though I never saw them move, when I looked in the side view mirror, they were somehow still facing us, turning to watch us as we drove past, watching without eyes. "Just keep driving," I said. As we drove on, the mannequins crowded the sides of the road more and more. There were thousands of them. Eventually they were so close that some of their outstretched arms hit the side of the RV. They were closing in on us, squeezing our path forward. One stood in the middle of the road. "I don't think I can get around it." "Run it over. Don't stop." The RV smashed into the mannequin. Its head shot forward and bounced against the windshield, and the vehicle shuddered as it rolled over the body. Soon there were two in the road, then three. I could see where this was going. Pretty soon there would be too many for the RV to ram through, but God damn it, we were going to get through as many as we could. "Speed up." "Mia."
Crash!
The sound was surreal, smashing into mannequin after mannequin at nearly 60 miles per hour. Hands, legs, heads and torsos flew. The windshield cracked. The RV shuddered and screamed and eventually slowed down, despite the screaming engine. I'm certain the axle was jammed up with lifeless, plastic body parts. Eventually we came to a stop. "She won't move," Mia said. She pressed on the gas, but it was no use. The RV just rocked a little bit. "Try reverse." She shifted and pressed on the gas. We got some decent movement before running into another jam. "Fuck." "Should we get out and look?" Mia asked. "I'll go," I said as I grabbed the flashlight and popped the passenger door. Mia unbuckled her seatbelt. "We'll go together." We stumbled out of the RV on the passenger side. It was like stepping into hell. Countless, lifeless faces stared out at us from the darkness. The only light came from the headlights of the RV and my flashlight. We clumsily made our way along the side of the RV. The ground was littered with mannequin pieces. I thought to myself, if we could get a couple yards cleared out behind the rear tires, we might be able to back out and get enough momentum to reverse all the way back out of here. Instead, when we got to the back of the RV, my stomach flipped and my heart sank. I was expecting to see a trail of flattened mannequins. Instead, the RV was now surrounded by thousands of perfectly intact mannequins standing at attention, as if their ranks had somehow been replenished after our vehicular assault. "This is impossible." She started to cry. I held her close. "We'll keep moving," I said. "It will never end. The tunnel makes no sense. It only curves one direction." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "This whole time the tunnel has only been curving to the right. It would sometimes straighten out or go left for a few yards, but before too long we were curving to the right again. We've either been driving in circles or spiraling downwards. So we'll go back the way we came and hope we're not going in circles." I said. We had been driving for hours at this point. Walking back out the way we came would take days. But now that I thought about it, Mia was right. We'd only been curving to the right. This tunnel seemed to be very gradually taking us downwards into the earth. Going forward would not get us any closer to escape. We'll need food from the RV, Mia said. I nodded, and we stumbled our way back to the front of the RV, the mannequins' lifeless faces watching us the whole time. I stepped up to the passenger door and nearly fell back when I looked through the window. What the fuck? I breathed. What I saw were two mannequins sitting in the driver's and passenger's seat. How they got in there, I have no idea. But what really made my blood run cold was that they were dressed exactly like MIA and I. They wore identical sets of clothes. The one in the passenger seat had my same New Order t-shirt and black jeans. The one in the driver's seat had Mia's green striped sweater and denim shorts. Their plastic faces stared out through the shattered windshield at the endless crowd of mannequins staring back at them. Mia stepped up and saw the uncanny display. What the fuck? Mia echoed. I pulled myself up into the RV and slowly stepped around my mannequin doppelganger. I avoided looking into its face, but I swear I could feel it watching me as I stumbled around it. Mia followed and we made our way into the back of our dark RV. Luckily, we had just stocked our cooler full of deli meat and water not long after crossing the Colorado state line. I handed Mia the flashlight and pulled open the cooler. I filled a backpack full of food and water. I turned and saw them. My mannequin double had somehow moved. It was standing in the aisle watching us. Mia's doppelganger was still seated in the driver's seat, but had turned to peer back at us with its eyeless gaze. Mia saw the look in my eyes and turned. She screamed when she saw them and backed into me. I put my arm around her and we stood there a moment, letting our skyrocketing heart rates return to earth. Let's get out of here, I said. I slid the backpack onto my shoulders. Mia joined me at the door. I looked into her eyes. Are you ready? She nodded. I kissed her. I love you, I said. I love you, she said. The look on her face killed me. She was terrified. I'm sure the look on my face was similar. I opened the door and we stepped out. We again stumbled to the back of the RV. Once we were clear of the RV and all the crushed mannequin body parts, it became easier to find footing, though weaving through an endless crowd of lifeless people was a slow process. It was pitch black. Without the flashlight, we wouldn't be able to see a foot in front of us. As I walked, the beam of light created the illusion of movement in the crowd. At least I hoped it was an illusion. The limbs of the mannequins seemed to stretch and turn, but the only sound was that of Mia and I shuffling our way through the crowded tunnel. Things went on like this for what felt like hours. Mia and I were sweating and aching. I was about to suggest we stop and rest, but then I saw it and I froze. Out in the crowd, beyond rows of blank faces, I saw a pale face, black hair and a dead smile. I saw two vacuous eyes staring right at me. Mia, do you see her? I whispered. See who? I slowly raised my arm and pointed. It was the woman, or whatever it was, that stared back at me through the skylight on the roof of the RV. Oh my God, Mia squeaked. I could see now that the pale-faced woman was tall, a few inches taller than the mannequins. As I pointed, she stared back at me with that terrible grin. What do we do? Mia whispered. I raised the flashlight and pointed it right at the pale-faced woman. I thought maybe this would scare her off. I was wrong. The light only made her appear more unsettling as she stared back, unflinchingly. What do you want? I yelled. She only stared back at me. She was as still as the mannequins. We have to keep going, I whispered. Mia didn't respond. Her body was tense as she held onto me. We've come this far. We can't turn back again, I continued. I pulled Mia's hand and we continued on our way through the mannequins, keeping the distance between us and her as wide as possible. As we moved past, She kept watching us. Though her movements were imperceptible to us, her eyes never left us, like one of those portraits whose eyes appear to watch you no matter where you stand. Finally, we got far enough that she was out of sight, but the thought of her being somewhere behind us only unsettled me further, and I quickened our pace. As the hours wore on, there was no sign of the pale-faced woman, and the crowd of mannequins began to thin out. They still populated the tunnel from one end to the other, but there was more space between them, allowing Mia and I to walk more freely. The mannequins on the maintenance walkway on the side of the tunnel seemed to thin out as well, and I decided it would give us a better vantage if we were walking up there. I helped Mia climb up the railing that bordered the walkway. Then I climbed up behind her. The walkway was elevated 3 or 4 feet above the roadway. We could easily see over the heads of the mannequins in both directions. There was, of course, no end to the tunnel in sight. We kept walking. The mannequins continued to thin out, but they were different now. There were mannequins dressed as maintenance workers again, but also mannequins dressed as families and businessmen. There was even a group of mannequin nuns standing in a single file line, heads bowed in prayer. Needless to say, we passed none of this on the way into the tunnel. I was feeling very hopeless that we were going to be able to find our way out. I was far beyond speculating how this was at all possible. It's not possible. And even if it were, there is no good reason for someone to do this to us. The only explanation was the supernatural. Then I saw her. Rather, I saw them. Arranged in the middle of the tunnel was a circle of mannequins with long black hair and tattered cloth. They looked exactly like the pale-faced woman, minus any facial features. I kept a close watch on them as we passed to make sure they didn't start following us. "A door," Mia shouted. Mia pointed a few paces ahead of her. There was a door leading into the wall of the tunnel. We ran towards it. Mia grabbed the handle, turned it and pulled. It was heavy, and Mia had to brace her foot on the wall to get it moving. The metal door groaned as if it hadn't been opened in years. Finally, it was open enough to see past. It was a hallway. It went out about 5 yards, then turned right at a 90-degree angle. The strangest part was the design of the hallway. It wasn't cement or pavement like the tunnel. The walls were wood-paneled, and the floor was covered in a thick carpet, like a house from the 1970s. "I say we see where this takes us," Mia said. There was no reason to disagree, but I wasn't going to get us trapped in there. I opened up my backpack and took out a water bottle. I opened it and handed it to Mia. She drank half, then I drank the other half. I slowly closed the door, shoving the empty water bottle in the crack to keep it from closing all the way. I turned to Mia. "Okay, let's go." We slowly made our way down the quiet hallway. We got down to where the hallway cornered to the right, and that's when we heard it. Ka-chunk! I whipped around. The door had closed behind us. I ran back to it and tried to push it open, but it was no use. There was no way it closed on its own. Someone had to have removed the water bottle. Our path had been chosen for us. There was no turning back. We continued down the hallway. We turned right. The hallway continued, then turned right again. That should have led us right back to the tunnel, but it didn't. This part of the hallway went on far longer than was possible without running into the tunnel. Then it turned right again. It went on like this. Sometimes a section of the hallway was 20 feet long. Sometimes it was 20 yards long. Sometimes it was 3 feet long, but it always turned to the right. At first it was a relief to be somewhere other than the cold, dark tunnel, but the hallway very quickly became claustrophobic, and before too long, I heard someone walking behind us. We had stopped to take a break, and I heard a third pair of footsteps on the carpet coming from behind us. I backtracked to the last corner. I was terrified as I slowly peeked around the corner, tense and waiting to see the vacuous eyes and inky black hair of the pale-faced woman. But there was nothing there. I wasn't about to backtrack any further. There was no one there, I whispered. Mia slumped against the wall and slid down to the carpet. "I think I need to rest," she said. I put my backpack down on the ground for Mia to use as a pillow. She laid her head down and was passed out in seconds. I had no idea how long we had been walking at this point. I stood leaning against the wall. My body was telling me to rest, but I couldn't risk falling asleep. I had to keep watch. I knew she was following us. I took in the details of the hallway for the first time. The carpet was a dull brown, and the walls a cheap wood paneling. The hanging lighting fixtures were shaded by stained glass, something you might see in an old diner. Who built this place? Did someone pick out the carpet and the lighting fixtures? Did a team of workers blast these tunnels into the earth? Or has this place always existed? Was this purgatory? I began to feel dizzy. I was panicking. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I slumped to the floor and tried to slow my breathing. I closed my eyes. I shot up in a panic. I had fallen asleep while I was meant to be keeping watch. I snapped to my feet and looked around. Mia was still asleep on my backpack. Then I noticed that the hallway had changed. A few paces away, there was now a plain wooden door in the wall. I slowly approached it. I put my ear to the door, and I could hear what sounded like TV static and the low murmur of voices. I discreetly grabbed the door handle and turned it slowly. I felt the latch bolt clear, and I carefully cracked the door just enough to peek inside. It was dark, so it took a second for me to register what I was seeing. I saw a small boardroom. A long table in the center was surrounded by seated men in suits. At the end of the table stood another man next to an old CRT TV that was playing static. This was the only source of light in the room, and all the men around the table were turned towards the TV. Suddenly the screen flickered from static to a solid dark background, and some warped New Age style music began playing. Then the words appeared on the screen that terrified me like nothing else before. In plain text the words read, "You will lose her." I froze as I knew these words were meant for me. I watched with terror as the men seated around the table slowly turned toward me in unison. They were mannequins. The TV screen then clicked off, and they continued staring at me as I could barely make out their forms through the near-pitch darkness. I quickly pulled the door shut and whipped around to look at Mia. I had a horrible feeling of dread that when I turned around, she would be gone. Like the message on the TV promised, "Eric, what are you doing?" Mia was leaning up and staring at me. Thank God, there was Mia, right where I left her. I pointed at the door and said, "This door appeared," and I... "What door?" she interrupted. I turned and sure enough, the door was now gone. I explained what happened to her, but I left out the message that appeared on the screen. "You will lose her." Those words still burned in my brain. I tried to force them out. We drank water, ate granola, and then got moving again. Hallways, endless hallways. After a couple hours of walking, we started to hear music. There were small speakers in the corners of the ceiling. I recognized it as the same New Age music that played on the TV in the boardroom. The melody drilled into our minds. Combined with the dull aesthetics of the quiet hallways and the endless right turns, the music had a hypnotizing effect. The lengths of the halls became more uniform. That is to say, the straight section of hallway was about 7 paces, then a right turn, then 7 paces and a right turn. "I think we're walking in circles. Or a square," Mia said. I looked at her and took out a bottle of water. I peeled off the plastic label and dropped it on the floor. Then we kept walking. 7 paces, right turn, 7 paces, right turn, 7 paces, right turn. And there it was. Mia was right. The label from my water bottle lay in the middle of the hallway. Somehow we had been led into a loop. I lost it. "Fuck!" I kicked the wall repeatedly and screamed. Mia just leaned her back against the wall. This was our dynamic. If one of us lost it, the other became zen and thought of a solution. More often than not, I was the one to lose it. I finally stopped freaking out. "There has to be a way out. A door," Mia said. "We would have seen it," I replied. "A hidden door," she said. She turned around and ran her hands along the cracks of the wood paneling. Most likely on the outer wall, she said. She beat her fist on the wall, listening for a change in the sound. I exhaled heavily, sweating and tired, and I started searching the wall as well. We checked the whole first wall. Nothing. We checked the second wall. Nothing. The third. Nothing. The final wall. Nothing. I gave up and slumped on the floor. Mia immediately went over to the other side of the hall and started checking the inner wall. "What are you doing? I thought you said it would be on the outer wall," I asked. Then we heard it. Mia beat the wall, and instead of the dead thud, we heard a resonate boom. A door. I shot up and started tapping the wall with Mia until we found where the door ended. It was the width of about 4 wooden panels. I lined myself up in the center, lowered my shoulder and pushed. It moved. It barely moved, but it was enough to confirm this actually was a door. I recentered and tried again. Lowering my center of gravity, I pushed as hard as I could. The door pushed inward about 3 inches. Then Mia joined in. We slowly moved the door. 5 inches, then 10, then 15, then 20. Then Mia slipped inside. I had a moment of panic as she disappeared into the darkness, and those haunting words came back into my mind. "You will lose her." I darted past the doorway, falling through the threshold and hitting the concrete floor. I looked up and there was Mia. Thank God. I promised myself I'd never let her out of my sight again. "The exit," Mia said. She looked and sounded as if she were 1,000 miles away. I got to my feet and followed her gaze. What I saw nearly brought me to tears. We were back in the tunnel, but there was light. About a mile down was the mouth of the tunnel, and daylight pouring in. Beautiful daylight. I grabbed Mia tight and kissed her. "Thank God," she cried. We started moving. Nothing was going to slow us down this time. We sped up into a run down the maintenance walkway towards that beautiful sunlight. As we approached, something else came into view. Parked in the middle of the roadway was a large vehicle. It couldn't be. It was. Our RV sat in the road waiting for us. We ran all the way to it, pulled open the passenger side door and climbed in. There were no mannequins to be seen. I fell into the driver's seat and Mia handed me the keys. I turned over the engine. The most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I shifted into gear and floored it towards the sunlight. As we got closer, I could see the green of trees and the blue of the sky. We were maybe 100 yards away. I turned to Mia, tears in my eyes, and what I saw turned my blood to ice. Just beyond Mia's window, that horrifying pale face grinned at me. The pale-faced woman was somehow floating outside of the RV. Before I could say anything, her hand smashed through the window and gripped Mia by the throat. Then in one horrible motion, the thing pulled Mia screaming through the window and disappeared. I slammed on the brakes just as the RV passed through the exit of the tunnel and sunlight flooded the cab of the RV. I threw it in park and shot out of the door screaming, "Mia? Mia?" I screamed over and over. I rounded the front of the RV and looked back at the tunnel, and what I saw shattered my mind. The tunnel was gone. There was only open road. I had lost her. Story 5. Something in my body is trying to escape. Have you ever experienced something that shook you to your very core? Something that makes you remember every single little detail of your surroundings from that moment in time, even years after? I can remember so vividly the moment I realized something was wrong with me. I was in my junior year of high school, sitting in class, just like any other day. I remember the smell of erasers and cheap cologne that permeated off my classmate who sat next to me. I remember the scratchy tag on my t-shirt and how I was resisting taking it off in the middle of class just to cut it off. I remember what my teacher, Mrs. Brown, was talking about, the fall of Constantinople. My mouth felt dry and I kept looking at the clock, counting down the minutes until I had lunch so I could get a soda. The sound of a pen clicking behind me was synchronized with the song that was stuck in my head. All those things were going through my brain at once. My ADHD mind went a million miles per minute when it all came down to a caching halt when I felt it at 11:23. I felt what I can only describe as a hand grabbing at the inner lining of my stomach. It didn't necessarily hurt, not at this point. That's not why I got so scared. You see, not only do I have ADHD, I also have OCD that manifests itself in the fear of anything growing or moving inside me, even if I think about the concept of blood moving in my body or a heart that is beating in my chest. I have to think of something else. I've had full-blown panic attacks because of it. The closest term for this is tocophobia. That's technically the fear of pregnancy. I'm a guy, so it's not completely accurate, but it's really the closest term. I mean, I also do have a huge fear of pregnancy. Not necessarily of me being pregnant, but even though I knew I could never get pregnant, the thought of it still made me feel sick. I bet you can imagine the terror that overcame me as I felt something moving in me. I made an audible groan and grabbed my stomach. My whole class turned to look at me. Even my teacher stopped talking to ask if I was okay. I stood up and started to run to the nurse's office without even acknowledging my teacher. My first thought wasn't thinking that something was actually in my body. Even stomach aches and the feeling of gurgling in my stomach made me feel this way before. I didn't have anything on hand to help with a stomach ache, unfortunately. However, the nurse always did. I sprinted across the school, hoping and praying that my stomach wouldn't make that awful feeling again before I got there. I turned the corner into the nurse's office with my tennis shoes squeaking in the process. I saw the school nurse, Mrs. Kennedy, sitting on the couch in her office reading a magazine. She looked up at me with a sweet smile that quickly turned into worry. "Sam, what is it? How can I help?" she said as she stood up and hurried over to me, putting her hand over mine, which was grabbing my stomach tightly. It's my stomach. Something is wrong with it," I mumbled with a red face. She shuffled her way over to her large medicine cabinet and she motioned for me to sit down. She asked me questions about my stomach, asking if it was pain, grumbling, cramps, nausea, etc. As she was asking me what my symptoms were and digging through bottles, the feeling happened again. However, this time was different. It felt like fingers grasping against the inside of my body. I screamed and wrapped my arms around my torso. "Mrs. Kennedy ran over to me to comfort me. "This seems a lot worse than normal. Maybe we should call your parents," she said as she put her hand on my back. It felt like some days I saw Mrs. Kennedy more than my teachers. Any small ailment would distract me so badly from class that I had to go see her, sometimes multiple times a day. She knew at this point when something was really wrong. Within about 30 minutes, both my parents were there with us. That may seem fast, but I'm an only child and my parents are very aware of my tendencies. They know I can spiral and like to be around if it happens. They kept asking me where the pain was. I think they assumed by the way I wasn't responding to their questions the pain must have been really bad. The reality was that I just didn't know how to tell them what was going on. I got so frustrated after they asked me over and over again that I just yelled at them. "Something is inside me. Get it out. Get it out. Get it out!" I lifted my shirt and was ripping at my stomach, leaving red nail scratches and cuts. My mom and dad ran to either side of me to grab my arms. Mrs. Kennedy had seen me go pretty crazy, but this was the worst I've ever gotten in front of her. My parents, however, had seen a similar situation before. Not exactly like this, but they didn't skip a beat on trying to help me. "Sam, breath. Sweetie, just remember everything is in you for a reason. It's keeping you alive. Nothing is going to hurt you," my mom said softly to me, trying to calm me down with the words my therapist gave her. "Ice cubes. Get him ice cubes," she said to Mrs. Kennedy as I started to hyperventilate. Mrs. Kennedy grabbed a Ziploc bag and started to fill it with ice cubes. My mom went over to her and grabbed an ice cube right out of the bag, opened up my hand, and put the ice cube in it. This worked in the past to distract me. I knew that's what she was doing, and trust me, I wanted it to work too. But this was different. I kept trying to tell myself that it was just a different feeling I hadn't felt before, that it wasn't possible something was physically inside my body, but I couldn't help it. Everyone in the room could see that this was getting intense. I think they assumed it was just a mental breakdown and that nothing was physically wrong with my body, but I didn't care. I just wanted help. My parents got me into the car with my mom even sitting in the back seat with me. She kept trying to distract me with conversation, but my mind was only on that awful feeling in my stomach. We pulled up to the ER and my mom guided me in while holding both my wrists. It felt like she was walking me on a leash, but I didn't fight it. I knew she was just trying to stop me from scratching my stomach. We walked in and I spoke to the receptionist. All I said was that I had terrible pain in my stomach. I didn't want to sound too crazy. I just needed a doctor to look at whatever was going on. After giving the receptionist my name and insurance information, we went to sit down. I was sitting in between my parents, and I could see my mom lean back to try and mouth something to my dad without me seeing. I didn't think much of it. I was way more worried about other things. My dad then went up to the receptionist. He pointed over to me and she looked a little concerned. I saw her pick up the clipboard that had my information on it, and she started writing something else on it. I asked my dad what he did, and he just said to not worry, and that he wanted to let her know it was urgent. No more than 10 minutes went by, and I felt a terrible moving sensation. I cringed and grabbed my stomach, immediately followed by not just the feeling of a hand grabbing my insides, but also scratching and pinching. I yelled out in pain as the other people in the waiting room looked at me mortified. A doctor and a couple of nurses came running over to me and helped me up. But I couldn't stand up. I was in too much pain. They put me in a wheelchair and started to head for a room. However, they didn't take me through the normal big ER doors that went to the standard examination rooms. They took me and my parents through a smaller door to the side that had a padlock on it. We walked through a white hallway that was very quiet. The doctor and nurses showed us to my room and helped me into my bed as I was wiggling and wincing. I had one parent on either side of me, patiently waited to stop my arms from scratching. The doctor was trying to ask further questions, but he could tell it wasn't going anywhere. I knew that my dad probably told that receptionist about my OCD tendencies and that I needed to go to the psych ward, not just to the stranded side of the ER. I couldn't take it anymore and blurted out that something was inside my stomach and it was trying to get out. The doctor just looked at my parents for a reaction, and they gave him a sad nod. It was like they warned him that this could happen. The doctor didn't just think I was crazy. My parents did too. The doctor took a deep breath and came up to me. I knew I was about to hear some kind of dumb speech about how this was just my OCD and everything was going to be okay. As he came closer to me, I pulled up my shirt and he gasped. Not only was my stomach scratched up like crazy, but we saw movement. It looked like when a pregnant woman can see her baby kicking. But this was so much stronger. It was stretching my skin. My parents stood up and gasped while the doctor looked frantic and unprepared. Shit. 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 Shit, the doctor said as he backed out of the room. Hang on! We are getting this taken care of. Just hang tight. Just seconds later, a nurse came in to give me some painkillers. I started to feel the pain slip away, but something so much worse started to creep in. I heard a voice, not my own, not some creepy-sounding creature, but the voice of a normal-sounding man that I'd never heard before. But that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was what he was saying to me. Get me out. Get me out. Get me out. It started in a normal tone, but slowly became more urgent and rushed, then demanding. The voice would coincide with the moment inside me. It was getting so loud that I was having a hard time hearing the people around me. The doctor came in just a few minutes after I last saw him. He was red and sweaty, like he'd just run a marathon. He told me they needed to do just a few tests on what was inside me before taking action. I was trying so hard to pay attention to the words coming out of his mouth, but all I could hear was the voice. The voice stopped for just a second and changed what he was saying. Now he started repeating, "Cut me out. Cut me out. Cut me out. Now!" I now knew this thing didn't just want out, but it wanted out now. I begged the doctor to just get it out now, but he wouldn't listen. The voice spoke up again. "This is taking too long. Don't be afraid. Get me out yourself." I think it could feel me resisting, Without realizing it, I was looking around the room for something. It was like I didn't even have control over my head or eyes anymore. I knew the voice was looking for a knife, but I was trying to ignore the feeling. I knew there weren't any knives around. I was in a very safe place, just as I had the feeling I was safe. It was immediately taken away. The thought passed through my head that my dad probably had a pocket knife on him. My heart sank. I knew this thing could hear my thoughts. I knew what it would try to do. The next thing I knew, I was on my feet, leaping for my dad. My body hit his. Luckily, he's in pretty good shape for his age and had no problems putting me in my place. He got on top of me and pinned me to the ground, all while I could barely hear my mom in the background, yelling at my dad to be careful. My dad knew something was going on and that I just needed to be on the ground until I calmed down. My body tried to flail, but it wasn't successful. The whole time, the voice in my head, now yelling and screaming, not saying any distinguishable words, but just having what felt like a tantrum. What made my dad the most uncomfortable was the kicking feeling coming from my stomach. After a couple of minutes, the voice calmed down and I felt in charge of my body again. My dad slowly got up and attempted to help me up. At this point, with an audience of hospital staff that looked like they were getting ready to take me somewhere for more tests. Just as I stood up straight, I felt the voice take over and I lost all sense of my own body. I felt like a shell of myself. My dad gave me a soft yet worried smile, and in that instance, I grabbed him and reached into his pocket. My heart sank as I felt his pocket knife. The room started to panic, and about 5 people tried to grab it from me. The last thing I remember is plunging the knife into my stomach. I felt a blinding pain and everything went black. Several hours later, I started to wake up. Everything was extremely blurry and fuzzy. I could hear a very faint voice telling me to relax. As the minutes passed by, things started to become a little bit clearer. I looked around and saw I was in a large room with a few other patients. A nurse was going up to all the beds and checking in on them. I tried to sit up a bit to get more comfortable and noticed an incredible sourness in my stomach. I moved my hospital gown out of the way and saw a huge scare, about 6 across. Most of the scare looked very surgical, like what I'd imagine a C-section surgery would look like, except where I remembered the knife going in. It looked like a bunch of extra stitches had to be added where it went in. It also looked pretty bruised. I can imagine that a dull 10-year-old knife that was harshly shoved into a body really wouldn't cleanly cut through and leave some damage. The feeling of shock from looking at my stomach was quickly gone when I realized that meant whatever was in me was now gone. I didn't hear the voice. I didn't feel a hand in my gut anymore. I didn't see that vile kicking anymore. I felt like I could breathe. I asked the nurse what they found and she looked flush. That's something that your doctor will talk with you once you eat something and can speak clearly, she said as she scurried off looking upset. Shortly after that, I was wheeled into a recovery room and my parents came to see me. As they walked in, they had a very similar look on their faces as the nurse did. They looked pale and didn't want to look me in the eye. I kept asking them questions about what was going on, but they said the doctor needed to discuss it with me, and he wanted to make sure I wasn't feeling high from the anesthesia while we had a conversation. The doctor didn't come and see me for another 10 hours, which felt strange. And to add to the strangeness, my parents were taking shifts hanging out with me. There was only overlap when they switched, and the other parent took over while the other one left the room. I would understand if they weren't both with me for the whole time. I'm not that needy, but they were only both in my room together for about an hour. That was the hour before the doctor came to my room. Finally, the doctor came in to talk to me. When he walked in, the room was cold and quiet. It was evident he didn't feel the same relief I was feeling. He seemed awkward, like he was talking way too long to get over to me. He grabbed a chair and scooted it close to me. Listen, Sam, I know this last 24 hours has been very challenging. I apologize for not explaining what happened during your surgery sooner, but we all needed time to figure it out. And quite frankly, process what happened. We feel we have enough information to let you in on what is going on. A silence filled the room. It felt like no one was brave enough to break it. And? I said with confusion. I think it'll be easier if we just show you." The doctor, along with my parents, helped me into a wheelchair, and we started to make our way across the hospital to an entirely different section. I couldn't believe all the things running through my head at what we were about to see. It felt like cruel and unusual punishment to leave me in anticipation and not just tell me what I was about to see. When I went around the corner, I couldn't process what I was looking at. I thought they were showing me a large tumor or growth of some kind. But why would a tumor be in a big incubation chamber with tubes connected to IVs and machines coming out of it? As I got closer, I started to see human features on it. It was mostly just a 6-pound lump of flesh, but I could see a hand sticking out of it. It was small, but what made it creepy was it looked like a fully developed man's hand, just small. I could see a patch of hair coming out of what I assumed was its head. It had no discernible facial features, just a few teeth scattered in one section. As I looked at it with disgust, coming to terms with this thing that was just in my body, I had a realization. I wasn't feeling sick at the thought of something being in my body. Sure, I was grossed out that this particular thing was just in me, but the thought of the bacteria in my body didn't make me want to throw up. I thought about all the blood pumping through my veins and I felt normal. Not only was the voice and kicking gone, but my OCD was gone too. I didn't have a mental illness. It was just this thing, trying to find its way out for years. As I was staring at the creature, the doctor came and put his hand on my shoulder. "We believe this is your twin brother." I immediately looked up at my parents, who looked very disturbed and upset. I let the doctor finish talking. "We believe that you absorbed him in the womb and that he has been living inside you your whole life. This is an extremely rare condition called fetus in fetu. It seems he didn't quite have the best opportunity to develop normally. That's why he looks the way he does. Despite his appearance, he has all the organs he needs to survive. Looks like he's missing a lung and his gallbladder. Also a piece of his liver, but other than that, it looks like he will live for at least a few years. He won't be able to leave this room due to him needing a feeding tube and a few other things that his body cannot do on its own. He needs lots of support just to live. What makes this situation extremely unique is that your twin is still alive despite your body not sustaining him anymore. Even though we have him hooked up to a few IVs and machines, it is unexplainable how he is living while outside of your body." I was in complete shock. I didn't want to believe it. I asked my mom why she never told me I absorbed my twin in the womb. She said she had no clue. There was never a sign when she was pregnant with me. He also mentioned that sometimes even in pregnancies, women will go their whole pregnancy without even getting a belly. It's called a cryptic pregnancy. I've always had a bit of a gut, but never anything big enough to cause suspicion. I guess in my case I had a fetus fetu and an experience similar to a cryptic pregnancy, even though it was in my stomach. At least that was the doctor's best guess. Although, it all sounded like BS to me. The doctor and my parents kept trying to explain more and more details to me. I don't know why they didn't slow down a little bit for my sake. How could they not tell I wasn't processing any of this? I noticed something while they were trying to explain things to me. They kept calling it a he. Now listen, I'm not some kind of asshole that won't respect someone who wants to be called a specific pronoun. I've never been that kind of person, but this is where I draw the line. Not just that, but this thing had a name. My parents named it and said today was its birthday. While they told me all this information, they didn't look happy about it. It seemed like they were forced to do all this nonsense, and now it was my turn to be convinced. I could tell they were trying to force it. The doctor told me, despite it not having a high probability for a long life, that we should still try and give it the love it deserves. Of course, the doctor referred to it as a he, but I refused to. This disgusted me. This thing tried to kill me and ruined my quality of life for so long. And now we are going to treat it like it's some kind of prince? No, absolutely not. Luckily, it seemed like it would never leave the hospital, but my parents planned on going to visit it daily. Visiting it? Are you kidding me? It has no eyes, no ears. It's probably miserable and has no concept of people even being around it. I'm refusing to ever see this thing again or acknowledge its existence again. I could get in trouble for even talking about this. The hospital or anyone involved has signed NDAs to not share any information about this until it officially dies. This is because it's a medical anomaly and the first of its kind. They want to do the proper research on how this all occurred before coming out with a statement. I just have to get this all off my chest. I feel like I'm the crazy one here when I know I'm not. I don't care if I get in trouble. I am scared that the doctors are trying to force my parents into giving this thing a proper life. I think that's why it took them so long to tell me. I think they scared my parents into keeping it alive and guilting them, or even forcing them into being its parent. I'm all for every life being important and all that stuff, but I have a feeling my parents are terrified of this thing just like I am. I am convinced they gaslit my parents into believing this thing is my brother. If there wasn't any sign of him while my mom was pregnant with me, could this thing be something else? This all happened about 2 years ago. It's still alive and they are still researching it. My parents continue to visit it despite everything. My therapist told me that I'm probably just struggling with jealousy now that I'm not an only child anymore and so much of my parents' attention is on him now. But it's so much bigger than just jealousy. Since this thing showed up and my OCD is pretty much gone, I've hardly seen my parents. I know I'm not just jealous. There is something more to this. I know it. Something just feels so off about this whole thing. What is this thing? Where did it come from? And what does it want? Story 6. There are horrors beyond life's edge that we do not suspect, and once in a while man's prying calls them just within our range. P. Lovecraft. Many cultures believe that fortune is in the eye of the beholder. It can take the form of many things: power, money, fame, even love. But if my travels have taught me anything, it's that life is all about balance. Where there is fortune, misfortune lurks. And no, that's not some new age mantra I picked up at a yoga retreat. It's the law of the jungle. I sized up the Balinese rental owner and gave it to him sternly. 100K per day. Take it or leave it. No, mister. Duelotka. Good quality bike. He gestured at his collection of Honda scooters looking worse for wear. 150K, I countered. Final offer. He shot up a deceptive smile and shook my hand. As he sifted through dusty paperwork, I knew I fell into yet another upselling scheme. But this rickety motorbike rental was the only one for miles, so I gritted my teeth and slid him the money. In the distance, rain clouds were rolling in above a muggy Balinese morning. I found myself in a rural area with rows of rice fields spread out in all directions. This was the Bali I wanted to see. The owner guided my scooter along a dirt path and handed me the keys. Om Swastiastu, I said in my awkward American accent, and then bowed even more awkwardly. The man stood stiffly and curled his lips. Judging by his reaction, bowing wasn't customary in his culture. I flashed him a "sorry, I'm a dumb tourist" grin and hopped on the bike. I fastened my rucksack and went off into the tropical landscape. With the breeze on my back and boundless adventures ahead, I spent the next hour zooming up and down the countryside. But as I was making my way to a temple in a remote part of the island, the scooter began to sputter. Then it gave 3 jerks forward and died. Shit! I spilled on the side of the road. I assessed the damage and grimaced. The bike refused to start. Of course, I got ripped off and he gave me a lemon. Why did I expect anything different? I kicked a dirt mound far into the field and stood there weighing all my options. The road was empty with no signs of anyone around. Then, as I blocked off the sun and squinted, a lonely village revealed itself just beyond the rice paddies. Thank Christ. I trudged in that direction, dragging my scuffed motorbike on one end. The area itself was beautiful. There were green, rolling hills and sounds of a nearby creek, and fluttering of sparrows could be heard. There was also penjaw everywhere, tall, decorative poles that signified the welfare of the Balinese people. But then, my eyes moved to a sight that wasn't as nice. It was an old bridge just outside the village. Cracks lined the worn, grey stonework and unkempt vines twisted around its columns. It was an ugly piece of architecture, and curiously, the only place without a penjaw. Beep, beep! A villager on his scooter honked before crossing the bridge. Moments later, Another motorist approached, and before passing, he too beeped his horn. I stayed for a bit and noticed that whenever someone crossed the old bridge, they would use their horn even if there was no one around. All of a sudden, on the other side of the bridge, a far-off figure was walking clearer into view. It was a woman in a red dress, long and flowy, with her side ponytail cascading just beneath her shoulder. She seemed distressed, like she was searching for something. Beep, beep. Another motorist drove by and broke my gaze. When I looked back, the woman was gone just as fast as she appeared. Thunder cracked in the distance and heavy rain began to pour. I hurried into the hamlet and came inside the first warung I saw. A warung, or an Indonesian eatery, serves delicious food day in and day out. The one I was in was no exception. The smells wafting out the kitchen made my mouth water. So I ordered, charged my phone and waited out the storm. The warung owner and her teenage daughter smiled at me as I ate. You could tell they didn't get many visitors in their village and were curious about my being there. "Mister, you from where?" the mom asked. "I'm from USA." I smiled back. "Saya, dari Amerika." The daughter tried not to laugh at my pronunciation. "Where are you heading?" She joined, with much better English than I expected. "Ramayana Temple. Have you heard of it?" I grabbed my phone and showed her the location. I was on my way there, but my bike broke down. Bolts of lightning flashed across the dull skies. "Ah, yes. Ramayana Temple, 3 kilometers from here. But," she placed a finger on the map, "from here is faster, only 2 kilometer." I looked at the shortcut she proposed. There was a narrow road that cut behind the village, and the entrance was through the old bridge. Jangan lewat situ," the mom said to her daughter with traces of fear in her voice. They exchanged a few more words that I didn't understand. "Before you go to bridge, you have to use, she tried to find the right word. "Your horn." "Ah, yes. You have to use horn 2 times before you go on bridge. Very important. 2 times. The same fear in her mother's voice was in her quivering eyes, and I realized she was serious. "I saw some people doing that when I first got here. Why do you have to use your horn like that?" At this point, the mom seemed visibly spooked and wanted no part of this. After more claps of thunder, the daughter added, "There is woman outside our village. She lives under bridge. But she is not really woman. She is." Her mom interrupted us by giving me the bill. She tried to fashion a warm smile, but her lips couldn't stop shaking. Something really got under her skin. Not thinking much of it, I finished my meal and called the bike rental. After the rain let up, they sent over a mechanic and got the rust bucket running again. "Thanks again for the food." I waved goodbye to my friendly hosts and rode off. The rain had been reduced to a light drizzle, and fog began creeping down from the hills. It was eerily quiet on my way out. I whipped the scooter around the bend, and there it was again, the old bridge, but much closer this time. I stopped to inspect the menacing structure. The fog covered much of the vines now, casting the appearance of gangly creatures writhing around in the mist. But it was all in my head. Of course, I didn't care much for third world superstitions and had no intention of using my horn, so I laughed and drove forward. After riding around for a while, I realized 2 hours have gone by and no signs of the temple anywhere. No signs of anything, really. Only dense jungle on each side and fog that seemed to have no end. How could I have gotten lost? The road only lead in one direction, and I was following it to a T. I kept riding, and finally, a fuzzy shape in the distance poked out of the fog. There it was again, the old bridge. It was bigger, more daunting than before. I hopped off in search of the village, but there's no trace it was ever there. Only me, the fog, and the bridge. Suddenly, there was a woman. She sat on the ledge, weeping gently and looking down at the water. Her red dress was soaked, and her hair was left in a disheveled mess. "Are you okay, miss?" I called out, walking closer and closer. The air was impossibly still. My heart pounded and I was covered head to toe in cold sweats. Finally, I went to tap her shoulder, but before my hand could even reach her, she snapped at my wrist and pulled me within inches of her face. I don't remember much after that. Kids from the village found me in pretty bad shape after I left the warung. Apparently, I ditched my bike on the side of the road and sat on the old bridge, staring down at the water. When they found me, I was muttering the words "Mana Anaksaya" like a madman. The kids took me to the warung owner and her daughter. Like the angels that they were, they cleaned me up and offered some food. After a bit of convincing, they told me the full story about the woman in the red dress. Decades ago, on that very bridge, a little boy was killed by a careless motorist. His mother was so grief-stricken that she hurled herself off the bridge to be with her son. Nowadays, people passing through will always honk twice, even if no one is there, as a sign of respect to their spirits. Mana Anaksaya means "where is my son?" To this day, I couldn't tell you what her face looked like. The events that happened are a big blur, but every now and then, just when I think I'm safe and warm in my bed, I'll see pale, putrid eyes looking down at me with so much sadness, and they never look away. Story 7. Camping Nightmare. My 11-year-old son blindsided me one day when he asked if we could go camping. I nearly spit out my lukewarm coffee in surprise. This was coming from the same kid who complained about the sun's brightness at soccer practice and whined about mosquitoes at night. So when he suddenly expressed interest in camping, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was such a far cry from his usual pastime of being glued to anything with a screen. We were hanging out by my truck one morning, talking about school. When Jake first mentioned camping, he nudged a pebble along the dry road, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Hey, Dad," he began hesitantly. "Think we could go camping sometime?" I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. Apparently, Jake's friend Daniel had been endlessly bragging about a camping trip he went on with his dad, making the great outdoors suddenly irresistible to my screen-obsessed son. "Camping? Huh?" I said, trying to contain my excitement. "Sounds great. But you know, it's not all fireflies and s'mores. There's bugs. For one thing, lots of them." Jake grimaced, his enthusiasm briefly dimming. "Yeah, I know," he mumbled, kicking at the dirt with his sneakers. I gave him a playful nudge. "If the weather holds, maybe we can just find a good spot by the lake next weekend. Just you and me. You up for it?" "Yeah," Jake said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. His response to the lake idea didn't seem genuine. A subtle shrug and a glimmer of disappointment in his eyes revealed his desire for a more immersive experience, one that involved tents, campfires, and a genuine escape into nature. Merely visiting the lake wouldn't cut it. Only a true camping trip would satisfy him. Truth be told, I hadn't been camping in years. Fond memories of childhood fishing trips and backyard campouts with my own dad felt like a lifetime ago. Work had a way of taking over, and lately, it had been consuming more than its fair share. But after listening to Jake's retelling of Daniel's camping trip story, it had stirred something in me, a friendly rivalry. I was suddenly determined to one-up Daniel and his dad, to make sure my boy had the camping trip of a lifetime. A grin spread wide across my face as I promised Jake, "Yeah, you know what, Jake? We're gonna go camping, and it's going to be the best camping trip ever. As soon as I can take a break from work, we'll go." Jake's excitement was contagious. He jumped up and down with joy, and I couldn't help but laugh. It hit me then that I probably should have introduced him to camping sooner. "Thank you."
"Dad!"
he shouted, his voice ringing with gratitude. "Thank you."
"Dad!"
Thank you!
I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, champ, let's simmer down a bit," I chuckled. "Head inside and get started on your homework. We don't want Mom holding this over our heads," I added with a wink. Jake nodded eagerly and practically skipped into the house, leaving me with a warm sense of fatherly pride. The weeks flew by, and I finally managed to snag some time off work. In the evenings, I'd pore over articles and videos on wilderness survival and the delicate art of s'more making. My childhood camping memories were more fuzzy nostalgia than concrete know-how, and I couldn't let my lack of experience show, not in front of Jake, and certainly not in front of that Daniel. Meanwhile, my ever-supportive wife, Sarah, decided to forgo the mosquitoes and campfire smoke for the comfort of our home. She said it was girl time with a good book and a long bath, but I couldn't help but sense a hint of amusement in her eyes. Traitor, I jokingly tease, reminding her of our grand mission to outshine Daniel and his dad's camping trip. She'd just laugh and say, "Go conquer the wilderness. Honey, I'll be here holding down the fort." It was true that Sarah wasn't exactly an outdoors enthusiast. She enjoyed a leisurely stroll in the park, but multi-day camping trips weren't her cup of tea. Still, I knew she secretly loved seeing Jake and me bond. And deep down, I hoped this man versus wild adventure might reignite my own forgotten love for the outdoors. My mission: mastering the art of building a fire that wouldn't leave us all choking on smoke. Identifying constellations for Jake, hoping I wouldn't mix up Orion with the Big Dipper, and maybe even catching a fish or two, although, based on my past fishing experiences, that might be the biggest challenge of all. It was time to put my crash course in wilderness survival to the test and create an unforgettable camping trip for Jake, one that even Daniel and his dad couldn't top. At last, the weekend we'd been waiting for arrived. That Friday, as I picked Jake up from school, excitement buzzed through the car as we pulled into the driveway. The moment we stepped through the front door, Jake's eyes widened in amazement at the sight of the camping gear I had, meticulously, or so I thought, laid out for him like a treasure trove for an intrepid explorer. The living room had transformed into a chaotic staging ground for our trip. A giant green tent bag rested at his feet, while two mismatched sleeping bags, one a vivid orange, the other in subdued camouflage, leaned precariously against the table. Beside two overstuffed backpacks, I'd proudly displayed a bounty of rations, mostly marshmallows, chocolate bars, and enough instant ramen to feed a small army. "Ready to conquer the wild with me?" I asked. Jake didn't disappoint. His eyes sparkled with an unspoken thrill that seemed to shout, "I can't wait to tell Daniel I went camping too." With the car packed to the brim and threatening to keel over at any sharp turn, Sarah pulled me aside just before we left. Her usually bright and playful eyes held a seriousness that cut through my usual humor. "Please, be careful out there," she said, her voice tinged with worry. I knew this wasn't the moment for jokes. Squeezing her hand, I gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll be fine," I promised, hoping my confident smile would hide any lingering anxieties about my own lack of camping expertise. Jake and I settled into the car, the engine rumbling with the promise of adventure, determined to make Daniel and his dad's Crystal Lake camping trip look like a backyard picnic. I'd scoured maps and forums for the perfect spot. Jake had mentioned that Daniel and his father had gone camping at the Crystal Lake campgrounds, conveniently close to our town. "Crystal Lake," I teased, as if it were the last place any self-respecting outdoorsman would pitch a tent. "We're going somewhere way better," I added with a wink. Our destination was Whisperwood Forest, a hidden camping ground 3 hours north. As the miles stretched before us, Jake peppered me with questions, his enthusiasm keeping the energy high. "Are there bears in Whisperwood?" he asked, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Maybe," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though a flicker of unease ran through me. The forums did mention some black bear sightings, but that's why we have all this camping gear, right? To be prepared for anything. Jake's questions ranged from the practical, "Will there be a bathroom?" to the fantastical, "Do you think we'll see Bigfoot?" By the time the landscape outside our window blurred into a patchwork of greens and browns, his voice had grown hoarse, and a peaceful silence settled over the car. We veered off the main road, following the rhythm of a narrow dirt path snaking through the dense forest. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty track. The air hung heavy with the earthy scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, punctuated by the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. With every bend and dip, the car swayed alongside us, its tires crunching on loose gravel. I caught a glimpse of Jake in the rearview mirror, his head bobbing with every bump, his eyes wide with anticipation and fixed on the passing scenery. After about 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing, the sudden brightness of unfiltered sunlight momentarily blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, I took in the scene. The clearing was modest in size, about the size of a tennis court. In its center stood a gnarled oak, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. An eerie silence enveloped the area, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves in the still air. I brought the car to a gentle stop, the engine sighing softly as it died. Jake's eyes sparkled with anticipation as he looked over at me. "Ready?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness. His nod was eager and swift. As I stepped out, my joints popped like distant firecrackers. I retrieved our backpacks from the trunk and hoisted the tent onto my shoulder, its weight familiar and grounding. I let Jake take the lead as we scouted for a camping spot. I knew it was important for him to feel like the captain of our adventure, the leader of our expedition. Watching his determined strides and furrowed brow as he surveyed the land like a seasoned explorer was hilarious. Eventually, we found a suitable spot, or rather, my son did, tucked away from the car and hidden by thick underbrush. Sunlight danced through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on a carpet of moss and ferns. Nearby, a crystal-clear stream burbled, its melody harmonizing with the chirping symphony of unseen insects. It was a secluded paradise, the perfect refuge for me and my son, nestled away from the world within the forest's embrace. With a proud grin, Jake declared our campsite found, while he scampered off to explore the nearby stream. I tackled the seemingly straightforward task of pitching the tent. However, the instructions were akin to cryptic hieroglyphs, filled with diagrams resembling abstract art and terminology that would challenge even a seasoned scholar. 20 minutes later, after much head-scratching and muttered curses, the tent stood, albeit with a noticeable lean to one side. "Behold," I announced, trying to hide the beads of sweat gathering on my forehead. Jake, ever the diplomat, simply grinned. "Coolest tent ever." "Dad!" As we unrolled our sleeping bags inside the tent, I sent Jake on a mission to gather sticks for our fire. He scampered off into the undergrowth while I patrolled the edge of the woods, collecting stray logs to bolster our firewood stash. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a figure peeking from behind a tree, but dismissed it as a trick of the fading light. Igniting a fire, often portrayed in movies with a single dramatic swipe of a flint, turned into a comedic ballet of fumbled matches and stubborn kindling. My attempts at channeling my inner caveman were met with sputtering defiance from the damp sticks. After 20 minutes of frustration, I surrendered to the ease of modern technology and pulled a lighter from my backpack. As if sensing my defeat, the fire roared to life with a satisfying crackle. I called Jake back, and together we roasted marshmallows under the shifting hues of the evening sky. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with fiery shades of orange and red, we shared stories and laughter, leaving behind the worries of city life for the simple joy of being together in the wild. As the clock neared 9 p.m., exhaustion settled over us like a warm blanket. Jake, his eyelids drooping like weighted curtains, readily agreed it was bedtime. I subdued the fire with a few nudges from my boot, but instead of fading completely, the embers seemed to pulse with an unnatural inner light, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves took on an unsettling tone. A distant howl pierced the silence, long and mournful, similar to an owl's call, yet somehow different from any I'd heard before. A chill ran down my spine, prompting me to pull Jake closer and tuck him snugly into his sleeping bag. "Just an owl, champ," I reassured him, trying to sound confident despite my unease. My voice echoed strangely inside the tent, adding to the eerie atmosphere, but Jake, already drifting off to sleep, remained unfazed. Before I knew it, my eyes had closed, and I'd drifted off. It felt like no time had passed before a soft nudge at my shoulder stirred me awake. Squinting in the dark, I made out Jake sitting bolt upright, looking at me. "What's wrong?" I mumbled, my voice heavy with sleep. "Shh," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's something outside." Half asleep, I assured him it was probably just a squirrel or a similar creature and encouraged him to try and sleep. I turned onto my side, seeking the comforting embrace of sleep once more, but before it could claim me again, I heard it, a sequence of sounds distinct from the forest's usual symphony. Footsteps, deliberate and measured footsteps, circled our tent. These weren't the light steps of a deer or the clumsy thudding of a bear. There was no natural rhythm to them, no telltale snap of a twig. They were silent, calculated movements. 2 steps, a pause, 2 more steps, a pause, as if whatever lurked outside was deliberately trying to be quiet. 2 minutes stretched into an eternity before the pattern resumed. 2 deliberate steps, a pause, and then 2 more steps, wiping the sleep from my eyes. I propped myself up. A glance at Jake confirmed he was still awake, his eyes wide with terror. In a hushed tone, I promised to investigate. He gave a small nod, and with a deep breath, I inched forward, my hand trembling as I unzipped the tent just a crack. Peering through the gap, I found the darkness outside impenetrable, the only light source being the faint embers of our extinguished campfire. Squinting, I strained to see beyond the flickering red glow. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure near the tree line, a subtle shift in the shadows that seemed to move on silent feet. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my tired sanity. Turning back to Jake, I forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay. Champ, go back to sleep." Whatever lurked outside wasn't any creature I recognized, and it showed no signs of leaving. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, a sudden noise shattered the silence, jolting me awake. It wasn't the familiar rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. This was a sharp crack, a deep, resonant snap of a fallen branch, weighty and too close for comfort. A cold sweat instantly coated my skin. Whatever had caused that sound was heavy. Quietly, I rose from my sleeping bag, the tent floor feeling small and exposed beneath me. Retrieving my flashlight, I unzipped the tent fully with deliberate care. The chilly night air rushed in, stealing my breath momentarily. With trembling hands, I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding woods. The once familiar trees now loomed ominously in the darkness. Shadows danced and twisted in the flickering light, playing tricks on my already rattled mind. I scanned the forest floor for any sign of the creature. A footprint, a snapped twig, but found nothing. Yet, just beyond the flashlight's reach, a glimmer caught my eye, a subtle movement, a flash of reflection. I focused the beam in that direction, my heart pounding, but saw only the swaying branches of a nearby pine. Convinced the source of the noise was ahead of me, I had turned away from the tent. However, the sound of leaves crunching behind me shattered that assumption. Whirling around, I aimed the flashlight toward the tent, partially illuminating my son, who sat upright with a confused expression. Whatever had made the noise remained out of sight. I had almost convinced myself it was merely a curious animal nosing around behind our tent. Just as I was about to dismiss the fear and retreat into the safety of the tent, ready to label the sounds as harmless, the source of the noise revealed itself, a moment that stretched my sanity thin. It stood up from behind the opposite end of the tent, where it had been hiding. It, or me, standing over the tent, partially bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight. It defied all logic and reason, even as I stared directly at it. My mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't an animal, as I had initially assumed. It was Me. I found myself locked in a gaze with myself. It had my face, but it wasn't me. Its limbs extended from misaligned joints at the shoulders, longer and more spindly than mine, though humanoid in shape. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs extending at unnatural angles. Clad in tattered clothes akin to my camping attire, its body seemed like a grotesque mirror image of my own. The most unsettling part was its face. It mirrored mine in almost every detail, save for the eyes, voids of absolute blackness in place of my familiar brown eyes. When caught in the beam of my flashlight, those eyes revealed twin specks of light within the darkness, staring back at me with an unnerving intensity. A single glance revealed its formidable strength, far surpassing my own. Its arms, thick with sinewy muscle, bore the unmistakable markings of a life lived in the wilderness. These were not the sculpted muscles of a gym-goer, but the rugged strength forged by the trials of nature itself. Mountains climbed, rivers crossed, battles waged against the elements. As its mouth contorted grotesquely across its face, the skin splitting like parched earth, a wet tearing filled the night air, an agonizing sound that sent a primal scream echoing through my mind. The chill of the night was now a distant memory, replaced by a fear so profound it threatened to immobilize me. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, a small, vulnerable voice belonging to Jake, calling out from within the tent, asking if I could see anything. At the sound of his voice, the creature's attention shifted sharply toward the tent. It leaned in, drawn by Jake's innocence, its already unnaturally wide mouth stretched further, the lower jaw unhinging to an impossible length, revealing a menacing row of needle-like teeth. The thing raised its elongated arm, which moved unnervingly stiff and jerky, like the movements of someone who hadn't felt flesh beneath their fingertips for years. I could see each joint crackle and pop as it extended its arm. I was confused as to what it was doing, but then realization hit me. Instinct took over. I plunged my hands into the tent, grabbing Jake, and yanked him out with all my strength. Yanking him from the tent, we stumbled out, the ground a sickening blur beneath my feet. We landed in a heap, the sound of ripping fabric filling the air as the creature tore through the tent like a child ripping through tissue paper. The metallic tang of blood, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. I covered Jake's mouth with my hand, feeling his tears against my skin. We lay there in silence, watching the thing eviscerate our tent. Amidst the chaos, my bag was flung towards us. Recognizing it, I rummaged through it until my fingers closed around the car keys. Leaning close to Jake, I told him when I gave the signal I wanted him to run for the car. In the tense silence that followed the creature's assault, a distant noise momentarily captured its attention. Seizing the opportunity, I whispered to Jake,
"Run!"
We sprang up and bolted towards the car, the creature's piercing shriek chasing us from behind. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, fueled by a primal urge to protect my son. Reaching the car, I fumbled with the keys, the creature's rasping breaths hot on my neck. With a satisfying click, the door unlocked. We tumbled inside, slamming the doors shut just as the creature lunged forward, its fingers scraping against the metal. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. In the dim light, I could see the creature standing mere inches from the car, its grotesque smile contorted in what seemed to be frustration. With a surge of adrenaline, I shifted into reverse, then spun the car around, tires churning the earth as we sped down the trail. We didn't stop until we got home. Throughout the drive, Jake remained silent, his soft sobs a stark contrast to my own stifled emotions. That night marked the end of our camping trips. It doesn't look like I'll be beating Daniel and his dad's camping trip anytime soon. Story 8. Macabre House. This is Jay, Moody, and Kai, and today we are searching for Macabre House. The video was shot in shaky cam, the footage hard to watch without getting a little seasick. Officer Wiley, Detective Wiley now, had seen a lot in his time on the force, but But a double homicide perpetrated by this 14-year-old kid in front of him was something he hoped he would never see. A double homicide, and carried out against two of his best friends. At that, the two kids in question, Marshall Moody and Kai Dillon, had been friends with Jason Weeks since elementary school, and there had never been any reports of violence or any other alarming behavior. At least none reported to the police. The boys had operated a YouTube channel, JMK Occult, for the last 2 years, and while their content was pretty typical for kids online, they had been uploading steadily every week since their first video about a strange deer in the North Woods around Cadderley. Hell, Wiley even watched their stuff sometimes when he was bored. People in the community knew them, and this was out of character for any of them. Wiley paused the video, the three boys blundering through the South Woods and chattering like a pack of squirrels, and looked at Jason. Jason, Jay to his friends, looked like he had aged a decade. He had a gaunt look, usually reserved for soldiers who come back from war. His hair had been long and blonde for as long as anyone had known him, but the kid sitting here now was as bald as an egg, and his scalp looked scoured instead of shaved. The shirt he had been wearing in the video was gone. He was still wearing the ring of it around his neck, the stretched fabric like a collar, and the jeans he wore were stained and ragged in places that looked fresh. He'd been found with no shoes or socks, but he was wearing the orange flip-flops of a jail resident now. Wiley knew his parents wanted to bail him out, but he wasn't sure if the judge was going to extend him bail or not, given the nature of his crime. The way those kids had been ripped apart was something that would haunt him for a long time. So, Jason, Officer Russell tells me that someone picked you up beside the road and you told them that your friends were dead and that you had killed them. Is that true? Jason nodded, not speaking a word as he continued to stare at the wall. The woman in question was Darla Hughes, a mother of 3 who had stopped when she saw a young teenage boy walking on the side of the road in the state he was currently in. Stories of kidnapping and kids held in basements for months, while God knew what happened to them, were clear in the public consciousness. Darla thought she had found some kid who had escaped his situation, and when she stopped to help him, she said the poor lamb had said 8 words and then nothing else. He said, "My friends are dead, and I killed them." They had found the kids in a clearing in the woods about 3 miles in, a site he was familiar with. How many times had he and his friends gone looking for the Macaro house? Everyone in Cadderley knew about Macaro house, and most people's childhoods had been spent looking for it. John Macaro, a prominent figure in Cadderley's history, had been a prominent importer and exporter in England. He had come to America before the Revolutionary War to try to set up a similar business here, and Cadderley had been a large enough port to satisfy his needs without being so big that a new face would be lost. He established a manor in the South Woods, despite being told that it was Indian land, and the bill of sale did very little to dispatch the native tribe that was living there. He survived 2 raids by the natives somehow, but his wife and daughter were not so lucky the second time. As such, he rallied a mob of townspeople to go into the woods and help him flush out the natives who were living there. The raid took weeks, but by the end, they had killed or scattered every member of the tribe that lived there. Satisfied, Mr. Macaro built his lavish estates there, but strange things surrounded it from the first. Workers went missing, people reported strange lights and sounds after dark, and a shriveled figure in skins and feathers could be seen lurking after moonrise. Animals on the property acted strangely, and sometimes people found wolves or bears on the grounds. Usually, they were in a rage, but sometimes they simply fled as if they had been drawn there and weren't sure what to do now that they were. Once the house was finished, John Macaro had a hard time keeping staff. None of the hands he had hired to keep his livestock would stay more than a week, and they all refused to stay on the property after dark. His servants would likewise disappear suddenly, and none of them would stay at night besides his butler, who had been with him for years. People said that Mr. Macaro talked about hearing chanting in the house and seeing strange shadows, and when even his butler disappeared one evening, John locked the doors and stayed in the house alone for a long time. People who came to see him said he could be seen wandering the halls like a ghost, calling out for people only he could see. When his mansion was seen in full blaze one night, those who were first on the scene said they saw a lone man silhouetted in the flames, his feathers and skins on full display. He disappeared when they got close, but he had been seen by many in the years to come. "What did you see out there, Jason?" Jason continued to stare at the wall. "I want to help you, kid, but you have to help yourself first." He couldn't help but glance down at the kid's fingers as he left them splayed on that table like sleeping spiders. The nails were dirty, the beds crusty with something like blood, and several of them were torn and ragged. There was grime around his mouth too, and Wiley would have bet his next paycheck that it wasn't a Kool-Aid ring. It looked like mud or paint, but it was probably blood. Jason remained silent as the grave. "Jason, none of us believe that you killed your friends. You're wrong." Wiley had been fiddling with the remote, trying not to look at the kid's hands, but when he spoke, he looked up. Jason was still staring at the wall, but his head was shaking as his teeth chattered together. The kid looked like he was staring into the mouth of hell instead of the creme-colored wall of the interrogation room. Wiley almost didn't want to ask him what he had seen, but he needed to know. He needed to know how this kid had killed 2 other kids, one of whom was bigger than him by a head and 60 pounds. "Would you like to elaborate?" Wiley asked. He didn't think the kid would for a minute, but finally, he just reached slowly and pushed play on the remote. He kept looking at Wiley like he thought he might slap his hand, but when he let him get all the way across the table unsmacked, he relaxed a little. The video went on as they walked through the woods, joking and laughing as the woods lived their quiet existence around them. We went in at 8, just after Kai's mom went to work. She wouldn't have liked us going into the South Woods, but we wanted to investigate Macabre House. We wanted to do it for our first episode, but Moody said it was something we should work up to. The Macabre House was something big, and we needed to be ready for it. Turned out we weren't. On the screen, the kids kept walking through the woods, checking their compass and making their way carefully through the thick brush. They were still chattering, talking about what they might find when they got there, and whether they would find the clearing or see the mysterious mansion that people talked about sometimes. Legend said that a ghostly manor appeared in the clearing sometimes, the ghost of the house, and that people who went inside were never seen again. Wiley didn't believe that, but as a kid, he had to admit that the clearing where the house had sat was spooky. All the wood had long ago rotted, the stones taken away for use in other things, but the land just felt wrong. Wiley had never been there after dark, but people claimed to hear footsteps and see things after the sun went down. Wiley pushed fast forward on the tape and watched as the kids plodded on and on. Jason wished that he could have sped through that part of the trip. They had set out at 8, waving to Kai's mom as she pulled out of the driveway. The packs had been pulled out of the garage after she was down the road a piece, and the 3 set out for the woods. They knew the rough direction of the Macabre house, but no one really came upon it in the same way. Danny Foster had said it was a 3-mile walk from the forest's edge to the property, but Jamie had claimed that he and his friends had walked for what seemed like hours. "When we found it, though," he said, "we found the house instead of an empty lot. We kept daring each other to go in, but we left when someone lit a fire on the grounds." Jason and his friends were hoping to find the house instead of the lot, and as their walk turned into a hike, Kai stopped and looked at the compass. "We should have gotten there by now." Moody chuckled. "Maybe we're going in the wrong direction." "Can't be," Kai protested. "The directions are to go south into the South Woods for 3 miles. Then you'll come to the clearing where Macabre house once sat." Jason didn't want to jinx it, but at the time, he thought that boded well for them finding the house. They kept walking, Kai good for an endless stream of conversation, and as the sun began to set, Jason found he was out of breath. His tongue felt like leather as it stuck to the roof of his mouth, and the lunch they had brought had been eaten hours ago. Moody had argued that they should turn around and head back, but Jason had finally vocalized that this could mean they were going to find the house instead of an empty lot. He was hopeful right until they got what they wanted. When the sun began to go down, Wiley knit his brows together. "I thought you and your friends were only in the woods for a few hours." Jason shook his head slowly. "We were, and we weren't. The time on the camera says we walked for 8 hours before I turned it off. But when I got picked up by the side of the road, it was barely noon." Wiley pursed his lips. "How is that possible?" "The video cut out, the battery in the camera having been exhausted," and Jason nodded at the screen. "Those batteries have a max life of 3 hours. Dad said it was the best battery they had when he ordered it for me. And it was pretty expensive. There's no way one of those batteries could have recorded for 8 hours. But it did." The recording came back on, and Wiley was shocked to see that they were standing on the lawn of an old Gothic mansion. The sun setting behind the house made a perfect backdrop for the shot, and the boys were oohing and ahing appreciatively. None of them seemed to believe what they were seeing. The whole thing a little otherworldly, and there seemed to be some argument about who was going to approach the house first. "Is that—" Wiley stopped to wet his lips. "It can't be. The Macabre house burned down hundreds of years ago. But there it is," Jason said, his eyes still fixed on the wall, in all its glory. And oh, what glory there had been in it. Moody had gawped at the house as he had never seen one before. "No way. There is no way. That's impossible," Kai breathed. "That house burned to the ground before our fathers' fathers were even thought of." "But there it is," Jason said, mirroring his later statement, though he could not know it, in all its glory. As the sun set behind it, Jason thought it looked even spookier than it would at night. The mansion rose like an obelisk towards the sky, its towered roofs looking naked without flags or pinions. The boys stood at the edge, trying to shame or bluster one of the others into going there first. But in the end, Jason took the first step. The others looked surprised at his boldness, but they followed closely after, not wanting to be thought less of. Jason expected the house to disintegrate as he approached, an illusion or a trick of the light, but as his foot came to rest on the boards of the old house, he felt their solidity and continued to climb. When the doors opened for them, the broad double doors swinging jauntily on their hinges, the three boys pulled back as they prepared to run. The camera captured their indecision, the portal yawning wide as it waited to receive them, and Jason seemed to surprise even himself as he came forward to investigate it. "Jason, what if it's a trap? This whole place shouldn't exist, and if you think I'm going to pass up the chance to explore it, you're wrong." Jason went in, pausing just inside the doors as if waiting for them to crash shut. When they didn't, Moody followed him, and Kai brought up the rear. Macabre House lived up to its Gothic exterior, the inside full of soft, dark velvet and antique furniture. There was a fire burning in the hearth inside the sitting room, tables spread with books in the library, and as they came up the long hall that led towards what was undoubtedly a dining room, Jason began to smell something. It was something like a stew or maybe a roast, and the smell of meat brought them to the dining room. A long table sat in the middle, 8 chairs on each side of it, and at the end sat a wrinkled old man eating soup from a bowl. It was hard to tell before they had gotten close, but the old man looked like he might be Native American. He was dressed in hides, feathers adorning his head and necklace, and he wore a beaded necklace with bones and claws on it. He looked up as they approached, glowering at them evenly. Before returning to his meal, he ignored the boys, all three standing back apprehensively before Jason found the courage to speak. "Excuse me, sir, is this your house?" The spoon froze on the way to his mouth, and the old man looked like he'd been slapped. "My house?" he asked, his voice sounding thin and whispery. "No, child. But it was paid for by my people. We paid with our blood. We paid with our lives. And in the end, the cost was high. I took some of that cost from the previous owner of this home, and now it's only me who lives here." Kai made an uncomfortable noise in his throat, like a dog trying to tell its owner that something wasn't safe. and Jason understood the feeling. "Well, we'll leave you to it then. We didn't mean to—" "Leave?" the old man said, sounding amused. "Oh no. No one leaves Macaro House until they've played the game. It was always a way for our warriors to test their mettle, and I have so longed to see it played again. Will you join me? If not, I'm afraid you might find it quite hard to leave." Moody took a step back, and Jason heard his heavy footsteps on the carpet as he tried to retreat. "What's the game?" Jason asked, figuring they could outrun this old coyote if it came down to it. Jason would wonder why he had thought of him that way, but he didn't have time to ponder it then. "Choose your piece from my necklace," the old man said, slipping it off and laying it on the table. "Claw, talon, or fang." "Then what?" Moody asked, Kai moving behind him as if afraid to come too close. "Then we start the game," the old man said, smiling toothily. For an old man, he certainly had a lot of sharp teeth. "Okay," Moody said, walking forward as Kai followed in his wake. "I choose claw." "Talon," said Kai, reaching out to touch it. "Fang," said Jason, and as he put his hand out, he felt a sudden, violent shifting in his guts. He was shrinking, the world moving rapidly all around him. He was smaller, but also more than he was, and he was trapped. His legs scrabbled at the thing that held him, and he tore it to pieces as he freed himself. He heard a loud roar and something big rose up before him. The bear was massive, ragged bits of something hanging from him, and Jason was afraid that he would kill him before he could get fully free of his snare. Something screeched then, flying at the bear's face and attacking him. Jason saw blood run down the snout of the bear, and as it tried to get the bird, a large hawk, off its face. Jason circled and looked for an opening. He was low, on all fours, and he could smell the hot blood as it coursed down the bear's muzzle. Blood and meat and fear and desire mingled in him, and as something laughed, he turned and saw a large coyote sitting at the table. Its grin was huge, its snout longer than any snout had a right to be, and he was laughing in a strange half-animal, half-man way. The hawk suddenly fell before Jason, twitching and gasping as it died, and he knew the time to strike was now. Jason leapt on the bear, its arms trying to crush him but not able to find purchase. He sank his teeth into the bear's throat, and for a moment he was afraid he wouldn't make it through all that thick fur. The bear tried to bring its claws to bear, but as the wolf worried at it with its fangs, he was rewarded with a mouthful of hot blood. The bear kept trying to rake him with its claws, but its movements were becoming less coordinated. When it fell, the whole room shook with the sound of its thunder, and Jason rolled off it as it lay still. "Bravo, bravo," cried the coyote, clapping its paws together in celebration. "Well fought, young wolf, well fought." Jason took a step towards him, but suddenly he was falling. It was as if a whirlpool had opened up beneath him and he was being sucked into it. Jason thrashed and snarled, trying to get his balance, but he was powerless against the pull as it flung him down and into the depths of some strange and terrible abyss. He came to in the empty clearing where the house had been, and that was where he found his friends. Wiley rewound the tape, not quite sure what to make of this. "So this strange man offered to play a game, and then he changed you three into animals?" Jason nodded, looking like one of those birds that dip into a glass of water. "I picked Fang, so I was the wolf. The game wasn't fair. We didn't know what we were doing, but I still killed Moody. I killed both of them because I had been the one to approach the house first. I killed them when I agreed to play the game. It's my fault. I'm a murderer." Wiley wasn't so sure, but it was hard to argue with the evidence. The video showed Jason dropping the camera, and then suddenly there was a lot of snarling and screeching. Wiley heard the animals fighting, but he heard something else too. Something was laughing, really having a good belly chuckle, and it sounded like a hyena. He couldn't see it. It was all lost amongst the carpet, but suddenly that carpet had turned into grass, and the camera was lying outside in the midday sun. Someone got up. Someone sobbed and moaned out in negation. and then they walked away. That was where the video ended. In the end, Jason was sent for psychiatric evaluation, and the whole thing was chalked up to a drug-induced episode. Jason and his friends were drugged by an old man in the woods, and while under the influence of an unknown substance, a substance that didn't show up on any toxicology screening, they killed each other. Blood was found on Jason, blood belonging to Marshall Moody, but blood from the fingernails of Moody was determined to belong to Kai Dillon, which really helped push the narrative that Detective Wiley was working with. He told the press to report an old man in the woods who was drugging people and pushed the stranger danger talks a little harder than usual that year on school visits. After that day, the tape he took from Jason Weeks was never seen again, but Wiley believed that the boys had run up against something they weren't prepared for. When John Macaro had led the extermination of the native people that dwelt on his land, he had angered something he wasn't prepared for either. Wiley's grandmother had liked to tell stories about Coyote, the trickster god, and how he could be as fierce as he was cunning when he needed to be. Wiley didn't think they would ever find an old man out there in the woods, but he didn't doubt others would find him. Coyote liked his games, especially when the players were people he saw as interlopers. Macaro House remained a town legend, and Wiley had little doubt that those foolish enough to enter would be presented with the same game these three boys had been given. Wiley shuddered to think how the next challenge might go when Coyote needed more amusement. Story 9. Undying Convict. We killed Joseph Glass for the first time on August 18th, 1999. I knew he was a strange case since day one. Never seen a guy so happy to die before. It was like we were doing him a favor. He refused the automatic appeal. He refused to be seen by a chaplain. He just wanted it over with. It had only taken a little over a year, and it was already time for him to make his appointment with God. He freaked me out. Just passing by his cell, he was like our very own Hannibal Lecter. The way he just stood there in the back of his cell, like he'd been waiting for you. The lights always burned out in any cell he was in, and maintenance had gotten tired of fixing them. Not that he seemed to mind in the slightest. The darkness seemed to swallow his top half, and all I could see were the whites of his beady little eyes poking out of all that black. Billy drummed his baton against the bars. "Up and at 'em. Cowpoke," he called in that mocking tone. "Time finally come for you to pay what you owe. You sick son of a—" "Billy." Warden Taft silenced him with a word. "If you can't act like a professional, you're going to have to sit this one out." Billy paused and licked his chapped lips. "Nah," he muttered. "This a show I can't miss." Glass seemed to tick Billy off more than any prisoner before him. He liked him to at least pretend to feel sorry for what they've done, or act scared of what's coming to him. This one didn't even have the common decency to shed a tear. He was as stone-faced as a statue, even while being marched to the chair. Billy liked to joke sometimes that we ought to take the guy out back with some car batteries and really put the fear of God into him. Get him to cut out that stoic act. I think he was only half joking. After what this guy did to those girls, well, Billy has a daughter, so I guess it struck a chord. We all watched him fry. The warden, his closest men, the thin-faced man representing the Commissioner of Corrections, the prison physician, the families of those poor girls. It couldn't have gone more by the book. Only oddity I'd noticed at the time was that the stench of death never quite left the clothes I'd worn that day. And then the next morning, we came into work to see the whites of those beady little eyes staring at us from the darkness again. "Good morning, sirs," he said, just as he did every morning, in that airy, hoarse little voice. I'll admit it. I dropped everything I was carrying, stumbled back, stammered like a confused child. Hell, I almost screamed. You're not... You're supposed to be..." "I don't know what you mean, sir." He leaned in like he was trying to stare a hole through my chest. His tone almost sounded disappointed. "You never came for me. You promised me that yesterday would be the end, sir. But you never came. I waited all night long. Why did you lie to me?" Me and Taft looked at each other. We both had the exact same question on our minds. If Glass was still alive, Who the hell did we roll into the morgue last night? Jesus Christ. Taft gagged when he pulled back the cadaver cover, stumbling away. It's Billy. I looked. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. And I'll be forever haunted by the sight of my friend lying there on his back, mouth agape and cloudy eyes staring into the ceiling, open wide as if he'd spent his last moments in a state of terror. The public never found out what happened. The cover-up story was that poor Billy had been taken by cardiac arrest. Internally, it was the scandal to end all scandals. Worst case of incompetence and negligence in history. They called it. They brought the hammer down on anyone even tangentially involved. Me and Taft were out on our ears. And they would have prosecuted us too, but that would have required admitting it ever happened. But I just could never wrap my head around it. Of those dozens of witnesses, not a single person noticed we were strapping a guard to the chair, not an inmate. It was impossible to the point of absurdity. Glass had been the man in that chair. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Some months later, I noticed power flickering off all over the city one evening. It was brief, so I thought nothing of it, at least until I got a call from a familiar number the very next morning. I understand you were one of the staff who regularly worked with one Joseph Glass. We would like to consult with you about an evolving situation. Oh? At 7 p.m. yesterday, we attempted the execution of Joseph Glass for the second time. There was a long pause, and when the voice returned, the professionalism had melted away, replaced with a baffled anxiety. And, well, it didn't work. I blinked. It didn't what? There came a long sigh. Perhaps it'd be best if you saw for yourself. And just like that, me and Taft had our jobs back. Officially, Joseph Glass had been successfully executed on August 18th, 1999. Unofficially, they'd tried again 6 months later, just to tie up loose ends. This time, he hadn't even had the courtesy to pretend to die. He just sat there on the chair, motionless and unaffected, while the CO, who'd flipped the switch, suddenly seized up and began to convulse, screaming and gnashing and wailing as electricity seared him beneath his skin, clawing at his chest until his eyes popped in his skull and rolled down his face like melted candle wax. All around him, lights flickering, machines bursting from pressure, electrical panels vomiting arcs of static. It was a mess. The feds were crawling all over this case now, from a department I've never heard of. Something about investigating preternatural activity. They told me Glass was refusing to speak with anybody but the COs who'd once cared for him. Being walked into that interrogation room almost made me feel like I, myself, was a convict being marched to his execution. Glass was staring at me when I walked in, like he'd been sat there, motionless, waiting for me. I expected nothing less. I took a shuddering breath as I sat across from him. I'd sat across from serial killers and psychos before and showed no hint of fear. But how could I not? Now, sitting across from a man who can kill people without touching them. Glass. Officer Mendez. His tone betrayed no emotion. I had thought you'd abandoned me. I winced. No. Glass. I'd just been temporarily relieved. It's good to see you again. Would you like a glass of water? I offered it to him. He didn't even look at it. His eyes just bored into mine. Relentless. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Silence. Okay. Glass. I need to know how you killed Billy and Kramer. I didn't, he replied. It did. It? The thing standing behind you. I didn't bother to turn around. I had enough experience with prisoners trying to trick me into looking the other way while they pulled off some half-baked escape plan. Glass. Please, let's take this seriously, I replied. I've always treated you with respect, haven't I? You've never had any problems with me. Actually, I do. I have a problem with all of you. Oh? You here all believe that death is a punishment. There was the first hint of emotion I'd ever heard in his voice. It's not. It's freedom, the only freedom. You promised me that gift. You promised me you'd let me die. You've given it to so many other prisoners, while leaving me behind. With all of your machines and your science and your knowledge, surely you can find a way, if anyone. My throat felt suddenly dry. I had to take a sip of the water myself, and hoped it would quell my burning nerves. We're trying our best, Glass, but you have to work with us. It may help if you told us what exactly is preventing us from executing you. He moved for the first time, leaning in, so slow as to be almost imperceptible. It won't let me die. And that's when I felt a hand settle on my shoulder from behind. Everything stopped. My lungs stopped inflating. I swear, my heart stopped beating, and my blood froze in place in my veins, and it all felt so cold. I could see the hand in the corner of my eyes, long and veiny and black. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I'd once mocked the way deers froze in headlights. Now I understood. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I couldn't think. I couldn't even take a single. Even as my lungs began to cry out for air, and my vision blurred, and my thoughts melded together, all I could see was Joseph's eyes staring into mine, those infinite fathoms of darkness, that Stygian sea that swirled and stormed and thundered in the blackness of his iris, and the eyes of things waiting a million leagues below the waters. And I would have suffocated there, too terrified to even breathe, if those agents in black had not called off the interrogation then and come storming into the room. Later, they showed me the tapes from the security camera. There'd been nothing behind me, nothing placing its thin hand upon my shoulder, nothing at all. On May 7th, 2001, Glass was set to be executed for the third time via hanging, or so I heard, in some government black site somewhere, far from prying eyes. While it was set to happen, me and Taft were sharing glasses of scotch in his office, nominally to celebrate. Really, because we were scared. Taft always struck me as young at heart despite his years. But this was the first time the warden had ever looked truly, properly old. He watched the yard below as he had a drink. Did I ever tell you why I chose this line of work, Mendez? I shook my head, and he sighed. Back in '63, they found a woman's body in the back seat of a burnt-out car in some state park near my neighborhood. A prostitute. One of her Johns had chopped her up, burned all the evidence. And you know what got me? Mendez. Nobody cared. Nobody bothered to investigate. Who will notice one less hooker on the corner of Fifth Avenue, right? It didn't sit right with me, the way I see it. Mendez. Every life matters, even the ones we try and cast aside. Everybody's got people who love them, and childhood memories, and all that. Everybody deserves justice, no matter who they were. He set down his glass and looked me in the eyes, so I joined the force. Got the case reopened, found the guy, and I watched him fry. And I like to imagine she was there watching, too, as he burned. There was a tense moment, and then a chuckle. Of course, after that bullet to the hip in '71, I couldn't walk the beat anymore. But I've been just as happy here, watching justice be served. It makes me feel like there's some kind of karmic order to the world, like there's some justice. Good deeds and bad deeds get repaid in kind. It was clear there was something lurking beneath his words, some unspoken thesis. Eventually, with old, wrinkled, tired eyes, he said it. I've thought about it, and if Glass doesn't die tonight, I'm finally going to retire. Mendez, he confessed, after what he did to those girls. What kind of order can there be in a world where a monster like that is just beyond justice? I was shocked. Warden Taft always struck me as an unmoving fixture. What would we do without him? He'll die, sir, I promised. It'll work this time. It has to. But he seemed deeply uncertain. With one last shuddering drink, he leaned forward. His eyes, he stared at my expression, as if desperate for me to understand. For me to know those things in his eyes. Haven't you seen them? And at that moment, Taft was yanked up out of his chair. It was so sudden, so inexplicable. I could barely register what I was witnessing. Some unseen force lifted him 2 or 3 feet above the ground, dangling him there. He choked, coughed and sputtered, desperate to gasp down air which would not come, and clawed at something around his neck which I could not see. He was hanging, I realized, and with wide, horrified eyes, the same as Billy's had been. He silently begged me for help. I sprang from my chair and wrapped my arms around his dangling legs. At first I tried to pull him down to the floor, but I realized it was only tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Then I tried lifting him as high as I could, which gave him some relief, but not much. Tears rolled down his face as it swelled and turned blue, and even though I could not see the noose, I could see the bruised purple skin where it had squeezed around his neck. All the while, I screamed myself hoarse. Help! Somebody, please! Jesus Christ, we need help in here. But nobody came. And all of a sudden, some unseen force seemed to sweep my feet out from under me. I dropped like a bag of bricks, but I was so startled I maintained my grip around the warden's legs. I fell and yanked him down with me, and his body suddenly jolted with a sickening crack. It took me a while to manage the courage to look up at him. His neck had been stretched far too long, and his head was bent to the side at almost a 90-degree angle, eyes wide, round and bloated tongue hanging from dry lips. And then whatever force had suspended him disappeared, and his body fell upon me while I screamed and screamed. I came bursting from his office to find my co-workers casually chatting and working just outside. Somehow, despite all my screaming and begging while Taft was dying, none of them had heard a thing. I took a page from Taft. I wanted out. We were dealing with something unholy here, something whose tendrils could reach any distance. And my life, who knows, maybe even my soul was at hazard. But the agents in the sharp suits made one thing clear. If I refused to cooperate, well, I would make the perfect scapegoat for the murder of Warden Taft. I was marched into the interrogation room to find a Joseph Glass that had abandoned all pretense of humanity. His eyes had darkened to a pure black, or perhaps he had no eyes at all, only windows into some place of outer darkness. I was shaking like a leaf as I sat in front of him, feeling more like a prisoner than he was. Mr. Glass. No reply. I shuddered, trying to focus on my little piece of paper to distract myself from the blackness of his eyes. I have some questions I'm supposed to ask you. Is that okay? Silence. I take a deep breath. How old are you? Glass. I thought it was just one of those basic questions. Conversation starters. Really, I couldn't have prepared myself for his answer. I am old. Child. His voice was nothing like I remembered. It was deep and low and rumbling, like there were multiple people speaking in unison, and all were equally ancient, older than you could possibly know, older than this nation, and older even than the empire that once bore it. I had to fight the basic animal instinct to flee, focus on the questions. I thought, why did you do what you did to those girls? Just so I could feel something again, he whispered. Anything. Did you not feel the slightest bit of guilt, remorse? You ask that of me? Me, who has watched empires rise and fall? He almost sounded amused. Does time feel remorse? For time has killed far more than I. But mankind is like the Hydra. All I've killed will be replaced by, essentially, identical stock, and in greater numbers, and then they will die and be replaced. And so the cycle will continue forever. Did you expect me to pity them for being given the death I, myself, covet? Only the dead are given leave of the cycle. It is a blessing. And suddenly, he stood from his chair, as if he'd never been restrained at all. A blessing you promised me, Officer Mendes. I stared up at him in disbelief. What? How did you? But I couldn't even stammer a sentence out before he was upon me, crawling over the table with the eerie grace of a spider. These were no longer the imperceptible hints of emotions I'd come to expect. It was like a switch had been flipped. Tears streamed down his cheeks, snarling with genuine rage, hurt, betrayal, and beneath those black seas in his eyes, All the things that haunted the fathoms below were rising to the surface. "You owe me a death. Make good on your word. Pay your debt." I cried out and recoiled from his every touch with disgust. But he was stronger than he looked. I couldn't worm my way out of his impossible grip. "I won't. Get off of me, you sick bastard. Do it! Pay me what you owe." It was like 1,000 different voices screaming in my ear. Straining and weeping, I locked my hands around his neck and pressed my thumbs against his throat, trying to strangle him. But instead, I could just feel that grip upon my own neck, squeezing the life out of myself as my lungs burned for air. Yet I kept pressing harder and harder, as if hoping I might somehow break through whatever unholy force was protecting him. And then those terrible hands grasped my shoulders again, and I was paralyzed by a terror that could be called nothing but ancient and primal. Like the thing standing behind me was the same force that had kept my ancestors huddled terrified in their caves 100,000 years ago. And every one of those voices was crying out to me through my very blood, and it pulled me from my chair, threw me as though I were weightless. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary. Once more, none of this was captured on the security camera. In the footage, I just enter the room and have a seat with strange, almost robotic movements, and then the both us just sit there, staring at each other, without speaking, without moving, without blinking, for an hour. After this, Joseph Glass entered a catatonic state, and from then on refused to converse with even me. Now that my usefulness had ended, the agents discarded me like yesterday's trash. Don't even seem to care if I tell anybody. Who would believe me? I thought I'd gotten lucky, that my nightmare was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Go sorting through any public records, and you won't find a single mention of the name Joseph Glass. They've squirreled him away in that off-the-books black site and scrubbed away every other trace of him. I'd say he'd been unpersoned, if indeed he could ever be called a person at all, but they're still trying every execution method in the book. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's for research. I'm sure the US military would love to find the secret to making its men as unkillable as Glass. And besides, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. On June 3rd, 2005, they tried a firing squad. I know this because me and my wife were out on our second honeymoon, slow dancing by the lake at night to our favorite song, when I felt a wetness against my chest. I looked down to see her eyes as grey and dull as foggy glass, and her chest shredded to Swiss cheese by rounds that made no sound. On December 23rd, 2012, they tried lethal injection. That was the day they found my son's car wrapped around a tree, and baffled coroners discovered that he was dead before the accident even occurred. His bloodstream polluted with pavalon and potassium chloride. It's been years since I've isolated myself from everyone I knew, hermiting away in this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and yet the stench of death still follows me. Just a couple years ago, I found a news report mentioning my nephew. Apparently, he'd been found completely exsanguinated, his veins emptied utterly despite no signs of a struggle. God knows what kind of arcane methods of execution they're trying by now. He's not going to let me walk away from this, not while I still owe him a debt. But I've been doing some research, too. Research into those untold legions of things I witnessed, staring up from that blackened sea in Glass's eyes. I've learned things men were not meant to know, practiced rites, assembled tools, ingredients, and I think I know where they're keeping him. Even though they blindfolded me, I counted the second between every turn on our way to the black site, and I've since spent weeks watching the place, cataloguing every entry point. Maybe I'm slipping into madness, or maybe I've truly found the way to put an end to the horror, to finally give this monster the justice that Taft would have wanted for him. Joseph Glass had been right about one single thing: I have to pay what I owe, even if it kills me. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories. as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.